In the spring of 1945, the world reached a breaking point, and one city stood where everything would be decided. Berlin, once the beating heart of a vast empire, had become a fortress of rubble, smoke, and fading certainty. Outside its shattered streets, armies closed in from every direction. Inside, civilians huddled in basements and tunnels, listening to distant thunder that grew louder each night, wondering not if the end would come, but how. This is not simply a tale of generals and battle plans. It is the final human chapter of a war that touched every household, including so many here in America, through sons who served, through ration books on kitchen tables, through radio bulletins that made hearts sink or soar. Berlin's fall was a military collapse, yes, but also a psychological one. A moment when a nation realized the story it had been told for years could no longer survive reality. Tonight, we'll move slowly through those last days, street by street, hour by hour, following the march of the Red Army, the desperate defenses, the final silence in Hitler's bunker, and the fragile dawn that followed. Stay with me, and let history unfold like a long night giving way to morning. You are watching Lullaby of Empires, where history dreams, the Western gates open spring. Came to Europe in 1945, the way it often does quietly at first. In the fields, the soil began to soften after months of frozen hardness. Rivers swelled with melted snow. In towns that still had windows, people noticed the light returning, staying longer each evening, as if the sun itself had grown tired of war and wanted to linger and watch the end. But the men moving across Western Europe did not feel spring as gentleness. They felt it as motion, as momentum, as the sense that history had leaned forward and that after years of darkness, something heavy was finally beginning to crack. By March, the German Reich was shrinking inward like a dying star. The armies that once seemed unstoppable, the gray columns that had rolled through Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, were now a patchwork of exhausted units spread too thin, retreating across a landscape they had once conquered. To the west, the American, British, and Canadian forces pressed steadily forward. To the east, the Red Army was already deep inside what had been Germany's industrial core. The war was not ending gently. It was ending the way great empires usually end, under pressure from every side, faster than their leaders believed possible. For the Western Allies, the Rhine River was the last natural wall before the German heartland. For centuries, armies had paused at the Rhine. Romans had camped along it. Napoleon had crossed it. In the First World War, it had been a line of fear and ambition. And now, in 1945, it stood between the Allied armies and the final road to Berlin. If you imagine the Rhine, don't imagine a single neat ribbon of water. Imagine it broad, cold, and muscular, moving with the confidence of something older than any nation. It carried barges and broken tree trunks alike. It reflected the gray sky. It was lined with battered villages, half-destroyed bridges, and fields cratered by artillery. The Germans knew what the Rhine meant. They had prepared for this moment for years. They had built defenses along the riverbanks. They believed, or needed to believe, that if they could hold here, they might still force a negotiated peace. But by 1945, belief alone was not enough. Not against the weight of men and machines gathering on the western bank. In early March, Allied reconnaissance planes watched the river the way hawks watch a valley. They noted every gun position, every road leading toward the bridges, every clump of trees that seemed too neatly arranged, too quiet. Along the western side, engineers studied maps, testing the current, measuring width and depth. At night, infantrymen lay in damp foxholes, listening to the low, constant sound of the river moving in the dark. Some smoked, some wrote letters they would never send. Others stared at the opposite bank with a kind of quiet patience, the patience of men who had crossed too many rivers to be afraid of this one, and yet understood that this river may be their last. Then, as so often happens, history found a way to surprise even those who thought they knew it best. On March 7th, American troops reached the town of Remagen. There, rising out of smoke and confusion, was something they did not expect to see alive: the Ludendorff Bridge, a heavy steel arch spanning the Rhine still standing. It should have been destroyed. The Germans had orders to blow every bridge the moment Allied forces approached. They had prepared explosives. They had set charges. But war is chaos, and chaos loves small failures. A wire cut too early, a detonator delayed, a nervous officer hesitating for a final second. Whatever the exact cause, the result was the same. The bridge remained, trembling but intact. A bridge is just iron and rivets. But in wartime, a bridge becomes a thought, a promise, a doorway. The Americans did not wait. Infantry units surged forward, running across the bridge under machine gun fire. You can picture that scene if you like. Men sprinting on metal grates, the river roaring beneath them, bullets snapping the air, the bridge itself shaking from explosions that failed to bring it down. Smoke poured from the far end. The Germans fired frantically, shocked by their own misfortune. But within hours, the first Allied soldiers were on the eastern bank. It was a crack in the wall. The first real crack. When news of Remagen reached Allied headquarters, it spread like electricity. Commanders understood immediately what this meant. They could cross now, before Germany formed a coherent defense. They could pour men, armor, and supply trucks through that opening and widen it into something unstoppable. Within days, the bridgehead grew. Tanks rolled over the steel rails. Engineers worked under fire, strengthening supports, patching holes, laying planks. Trucks carrying ammunition and fuel rumbled across in endless lines, their drivers white-knuckled, dodging shells that exploded in the river below. The Germans tried to destroy the bridge from the air. Planes came in low, dropping bombs. They sent frogmen to place mines in the river, and artillery units hammered the span night and day. But the bridge held long enough, just long enough to matter. The Rhine had been crossed, and once crossed, the war in the West began to feel less like a campaign and more like a flood. The Western Allied armies moved into Germany in a broad, confident sweep. They entered towns where white flags hung from shattered windows. They found roads jammed with refugees, women with pushcarts, elderly men guiding bicycles, children carrying sacks of bedding that looked too heavy for their bodies. Many German civilians had been told their whole lives that the Allies were monsters. Yet here they were, tired young Americans with muddy boots, British soldiers sipping tea in doorways, Canadian units advancing with quiet professionalism. It was not the apocalypse they had been promised, but the fear was real anyway. Because fear, by late war, no longer needed propaganda. It needed only the sound of distant guns. In some places, German resistance still flared. SS units and die-hard loyalists fought bitterly, especially in forests and near industrial zones. But resistance was not coordinated. It was not strategic. It was a series of clenched fists against a tidal wave. The German army in the West had no fuel, little ammunition, fewer trained men, and almost no air support. Many divisions were made of teenage boys, older men, or soldiers pulled out of hospitals and thrown back into uniforms. There were moments of stubborn defense, yes, towns that had to be taken house by house, pockets of artillery that refused to surrender, bridges destroyed at the last possible moment. But the pattern was clear everywhere. Fight briefly, then fall back. Fight again, then fracture. And behind every retreat was the knowledge that there was nowhere left to retreat to. The Allies advanced through the Ruhr, Germany's industrial lung. Here, the scale of the collapse became impossible to hide. The Ruhr had fed the Reich's war machine for years, producing coal, steel, and weapons. Now it was ringed by Allied forces from multiple directions. In April, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were trapped there, surrounded in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. They fought for a short while, then surrendered in masses so large that Allied officers struggled to process them all. Lines of prisoners stretched for miles, their helmets and rifles piled in heaps like discarded relics. If you had stood on a hill overlooking that surrender, you would have seen not triumph, but exhaustion. Men shuffling forward with empty eyes. Men who had marched east in 1941 believing they were building a 1,000-year empire, now walking into captivity before the empire even reached year 12. For the soldiers of the Western Allies, the mood was complicated. Many felt the relief of nearing the end. But there was also something quieter, the dawning awareness of what they were walking into, because every mile deeper into Germany revealed more of the Reich's true cost. The camps came first as rumors, then as realities. Barbed wire, guard towers, the smell that hit you before you understood why. Allied units were not prepared for what they saw behind those gates. Some soldiers later said they had felt fury. Others said numbness. Many said nothing for years. But every camp was a kind of silent announcement. This war was not only about territory, it was about what power had done to human beings when no one could stop it. And so the Allies moved forward with a harsher clarity. Whatever doubts remained about finishing the war dissolved in the face of that evidence. Meanwhile, on the other side of Germany, the Red Army was already approaching Berlin itself. The two giant fronts, west and east, were now moving toward each other like closing jaws. German leaders in Berlin still spoke of miracle weapons, of last-minute reversals, of imaginary armies that would rise and sweep the invaders away. But their words were smoke in an empty room. The reality on the ground was different. In the West, Hitler's final gambit had already failed months earlier. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had been his last attempt to split the Allies and force a negotiated end. It had cost Germany the fuel, tanks, and experienced men it could least afford to lose. Now, those losses came due. Germany could not fix the holes in its line. It could not form new armored spearheads. It could not even keep supply roads open without Allied planes tearing them apart. If the Reich was a fortress, the walls were collapsing faster than anyone inside could carry bricks. In the cities the Allies took, a strange stillness often followed. After years of air raids and propaganda, after months of hearing that enemy soldiers would burn whole towns, most civilians expected cruelty. But more often they met firm, weary men who wanted order, not chaos. Occupation was strict, curfews were enforced, weapons were seized, but there was not a wave of vengeance. Not in the West. There was something else instead, the cold efficiency of war ending. It's worth pausing here, because this moment matters to the shape of the story. The crossing of the Rhine wasn't just another battle. It was the point at which the Third Reich lost the last shield on its western side. After that, there was no line to fall back to, no natural obstacle to regroup behind, no hope of delaying the Allies long enough to change the war's outcome. Remagen was the door. The Rhine crossings that followed were the full opening. By late March, the Allies launched Operation Plunder, mass crossings of the Rhine near Wesel, supported by airborne troops, dropping behind German lines. The scale was astonishing. Thousands of artillery guns firing in synchronized thunder, amphibious vehicles crawling into the current, smoke screens stretching across the river like low clouds, paratroopers descending into fields and forests to seize roads before the Germans could destroy them. It was war at its most industrial, its most coordinated, almost impersonal in its precision. The Germans were hit from front and back before they could even understand the shape of what was happening. And once again, the river was crossed. At that point, Germany was less a battlefield and more a corridor. The Allies did not stop. They did not pause for long triumphs. They drove onward because speed was now mercy. Mercy to their own men, mercy to civilians, and even mercy in the cold strategic sense that a shorter war meant fewer dead. As April arrived, the Western Allies pushed deeper toward the Elbe River, the line agreed upon with the Soviets as the meeting point. The two sides were set to link up, sealing the Reich's fate. In some areas, German units surrendered eagerly, desperate to be captured by the Western Allies rather than the Red Army, whose reputation for vengeance had spread like wildfire across Germany. In others, SS officers tried to force last stands, sometimes shooting their own men for refusing. But even these brutal efforts could not revive a dying structure. Berlin itself was now a distant heartbeat ahead, still untaken, still screaming in the east. But the West had already done something irreversible. It had broken Germany open. For the old men and women listening now, there is a quiet truth in this chapter. Wars don't end in one dramatic moment. They end in a chain of collapses. One door opens, one river is crossed, one army surrenders, and suddenly the world you thought was immovable is falling apart in your hands. That is what the Rhine meant in 1945. A wall turned to a roadway, a barrier turned to a passage. A symbol of German resilience turned into evidence that resilience had run out. And so, with the Rhine behind them, the Western armies moved into the inner body of Germany. The Reich in the West was finished. The only question left was how Berlin, already surrounded in blood and fire, would meet its own end. In the next chapter, we follow the war's tightening coil. Germany retreating, civilians fleeing, commanders grasping at fantasies, and the two fronts turning the country into a narrowing corridor of inevitability. For now, let the river fade behind us in the dark. We've crossed it. History has crossed it. And the road ahead leads straight into the last, desperate heart of an empire collapsing into dust. The Reich contracts. If Chapter 1 was the moment the western gates opened, Chapter 2 is the feeling of the walls drawing inward. By April of 1945, Germany was no longer a country fighting a war. It was a country being compressed by one. The Reich had once spread like a shadow across Europe through Poland, Denmark, France, the Balkans, deep into the Soviet Union. But now that shadow was retreating back toward its source, pulled tight from all sides, shrinking day by day, mile by mile, into the space around Berlin. You can think of it like a winter lake thawing from every edge. At first, the ice seems solid. In the center, it still looks safe, but the water has already begun to eat away at the perimeter. You don't hear it. You don't see it clearly. And then, suddenly, the edges crumble, the cracks race inward, and the whole surface gives way. That is what April felt like in Germany. To the west, the Allied armies moved with a confidence born of momentum. Their tanks were fueled. Their supply columns were long and steady. Their skies belonged to them. Town after town fell not because the Germans didn't want to resist, but because resistance had become a kind of theater, brave, bitter, and hopeless. Units fought until they ran out of ammunition, then surrendered, or fought until their officers were killed, then surrendered, or, in thousands of cases, simply surrendered the moment the Allies arrived, because there was no structure left to give their deaths meaning. To the east, the Red Army was a different kind of force, larger, harsher, burning with the memory of what Germany had done to their nation. They advanced like a storm front. Villages were swallowed first by artillery, then by infantry, then by tanks rolling through smoke. The Soviets were already across the Oder River, already pressing toward the outer districts of Berlin. Every day, their guns were closer. Every night, the horizon to the east pulsed red like a bruise. Between these two fronts, Germany began to collapse not as a single event, but as a long, exhausted unraveling. On the roads, the most visible sign of that unraveling was the civilian tide. By early April, German refugees streamed westward in endless lines. They came from the east, Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia, places that had been German for generations, but were now being overtaken by Soviet forces. They carried what they could on carts, bicycles, or their own backs, bedding tied with rope, pots and pans clanging, a chicken in a crate, a baby bundled tight against the cold April wind. Some elderly men pushed wagons while their wives walked beside them in silence. Some teenage boys wore bits of uniform, half soldier, and half-child, walking with eyes that had aged too fast. They moved through a landscape that barely resembled their country anymore. The roads were cratered, bridges were blown, trees were splintered by shell fire. The air smelled of smoke, damp earth, and something else, something that was hard to name but easy to feel. It was the smell of a society collapsing in real time. In these refugee columns, there was often no speaking. Talking didn't help. Everyone knew what was behind them. Ruins, Soviet guns, chaos. Everyone sensed what was ahead. Occupation, hunger, uncertainty. So they walked and walked and walked. For many, the fear wasn't abstract. It had a face. German civilians had heard stories of Soviet vengeance for years. Nazi propaganda had sharpened those stories like knives, painting the Red Army as savages. But even without propaganda, fear spread naturally through an army and a population that knew what it had done in the East. People often fear the return of what they themselves have unleashed. So they ran. And because they ran, the roads became crowded. And because the roads became crowded, military movement became harder. And because military movement became harder, Germany's defenses collapsed even faster. That is one of war's bitter ironies. The more you try to escape it, the more it consumes what you are trying to save. Inside Berlin, the war was not a tide, but a tightening fist. If you could have stood on a rooftop in the city in early April, if rooftops had still been safe, you would have seen the city as a gray, ragged animal crouched at the edge of a forest fire. Berlin had been bombed for years, cracked open by air raids that gnawed at its streets and factories. Many neighborhoods were already ruins, but now a deeper kind of dread settled in, not about bombs falling from above, but about armies rising from the earth itself. Each day, radio broadcasts tried to sound confident. They spoke of holding the capital, of new formations, of final victories, but fewer people believed them. Faith in the regime was not disappearing in some sudden moral awakening. It was vanishing because reality was louder than words. Reality was artillery. Across the city, Hitler's orders were still being delivered with a kind of sick ritual. The Führer demanded the city be held to the last man. He spoke of loyalty, honor, sacrifice. He accused any suggestion of surrender as treason. But in the streets, those orders met exhausted faces and empty storage rooms. They met teenagers being handed rifles. They met old men being told to dig trenches. They met mothers with children in cellars, wondering how much longer the walls above them could stand. Berlin had become a fortress on paper. In truth, it was a cage. The final defenders of Berlin were a mosaic of desperation. There were still regular Wehrmacht units, some battle-worn, some shattered. There were SS formations loyal to the end, hardened by ideology. And there were the Volkssturm, a militia drafted from the city's remaining men. Clerks, tram drivers, shopkeepers, boys with school books still in their bags, and grandfathers who had already fought one world war and prayed they would never see another. They were given armbands, a few days of training, and weapons that were sometimes older than they were. The regime called it heroic. Many Berliners recognized it for what it was, a last, tragic performance demanded by a leadership too proud or too deluded to step away from the stage. And so, the city prepared itself in the only ways it could. Streets were blocked with rubble. Tram cars were overturned. Tanks that could no longer move were dug into intersections like metal bunkers. Buildings were turned into firing positions. Windows sandbagged. Stairwells wired for explosives. Basements stocked with ammunition and fear. Snipers were placed in the upper floors of half-collapsed apartments. Mines were buried in parks and along roads. The underground became vital subway tunnels, sewers, cellars. Berlin's beneath world, once a place of commuting and plumbing, became a nervous system for a city waiting to be torn apart. And above ground, the city held its breath. But here's the quiet truth that makes this chapter feel so heavy. By April 1945, Berlin's fate was already sealed. Not because Berlin was weak, but because Germany as a whole had been hollowed out. A city can fight, A city can delay, but a city cannot win when the war around it has already ended. Even many German officers knew this. Some tried to evacuate civilians while they still could. Others focused on delay, not for victory, but for time. Time for people to flee westward. Time for wounded to be moved. Time for the idea of a negotiated surrender to reach someone who might listen. But Hitler did not listen. Inside his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, he watched maps and issued directives as if they were spells. He demanded divisions that no longer existed to counterattack. He believed armies were moving that had already been destroyed. He clung to fantasies of a split between the Western Allies and the Soviets, a miracle that would allow Germany to survive by turning its enemies against each other. It was not strategy anymore, it was refusal, and refusal, at this stage, only added to the suffering. In the West, Allied leaders were already discussing what Germany would look like after surrender. They had their own worries, their own disagreements, but none of them doubted the shape of the ending. The war was finished in everything but paperwork. Their focus was now on getting to the agreed meeting lines, especially the Elbe River, before chaos and desperation could create new problems. When American and Soviet troops finally met at Torgau on April 25th, it felt like a hinge snapping shut. Two soldiers, one American, one Soviet, stepped toward each other on the shattered bridge over the Elbe. They smiled. They embraced. Someone took a photograph. Behind them, their armies filled the horizon. In that moment, Germany was physically cut in half. Whatever breath the Reich still had was trapped in Berlin. You might imagine that once a city knows it is surrounded, surrender becomes automatic. But human beings do not surrender in tidy lines. Surrender involves fear, pride, and confusion. It involves rumor and propaganda, and the raw instinct to keep breathing even when breathing seems pointless. In Berlin, many defended not because they believed victory was possible, but because they believed defeat was unthinkable. They feared Soviet vengeance. They feared punishment by their own officers if they laid down arms. They feared what surrender would mean for their families. And beyond fear was something deeper: exhaustion mixed with fatalism. A sense that history had chosen this ending, and that fighting, futile as it was, gave them something to do inside the disaster. If that sounds hard to understand, think of any moment in your own life when everything was falling apart: an illness, a loss, a crisis, and you found yourself doing small tasks, not because the tasks could change the outcome, but because doing something felt better than waiting helplessly for the blow. That is how many Berliners lived in April. They did what they could. Mothers gathered water in buckets when the taps ran dry. Neighbors shared the last potatoes from a pantry. Men reinforced barricades with broken furniture. Children carried messages down stairwells because adults were too afraid to move in the streets. Hospitals worked in basements, operating under candlelight, running out of bandages, washing wounds with boiled water, and hope. The city moved like a wounded animal, slower now, but still alive. And over all of it, the sound of Soviet guns grew heavier, closer. You could hear them at night, not as individual explosions, but as a continuous grinding thunder from the east. Berliners described it later, like an approaching storm you could not outrun. Some could tell the difference between shells by sound alone: the deep thump of heavy artillery, the sharper crack of mortars, the long whining rush of rockets. They knew the rhythm was changing. They knew the end was walking toward them. At this stage, street corners started to feel like front lines, even before the front arrived. People no longer trusted silence. Silence could mean the Soviets were close. Silence could mean your neighbor had died in the night. Silence could mean the church across the block had collapsed and no one had bothered to report it. So in Berlin, April was not a month. It was a slow closing of a door. It is important to keep our tone gentle here, because the temptation in telling war stories is to lean into spectacle, the explosions, the numbers, the obvious drama. But for those who lived it, war's final days are often quieter than we imagine. There is less shouting and more waiting, less clarity and more feeling your way through smoke. Berlin in April was a city waiting for a wave it could already hear. The defenders were in position. The civilians were underground. The leadership was in denial. The Red Army was readying its final offensive. The Western Allies were no longer racing for victory, but for the line where their advance was meant to stop. History had narrowed to one place, to Berlin. And so, Chapter 2 ends with the Reich contracting into its last space. The walls are closer now. The air is thinner. The city is bracing. In the next chapter, we will step into the opening thunder of the Battle of Berlin itself. The first Soviet bombardments, the outer districts igniting, and the moment when this battered capital becomes a single vast battlefield, street by street. For now, rest in the quiet just before the storm, because after this, there will be no more retreating. Only the final collision of armies inside a city that has nowhere left to run. The first thunder, Berlin under fire. By the time the first real thunder reached Berlin, the city had already been living with shadows for years. It had endured air raids, shortages, funerals without bodies, and nights where the sirens never seemed to stop. But what came in mid-April of 1945 was different. This was not the distant threat of airplanes high above the clouds. This was the earth itself, shaking under the weight of an army that had crossed half a continent to arrive at your doorstep. On April 16th, the Soviet offensive toward Berlin began in full force. The Red Army had assembled an avalanche of men, guns, tanks, and aircraft along the Oder and Neisse rivers. They were not coming to negotiate, and they were not coming to pause. They were coming to finish the war in the place where it had been imagined, directed, and defended to the last. For Berlin, that meant one thing. The sky was about to fall, and the ground was about to rise. The opening barrage was like nothing the city had ever heard. Tens of thousands of Soviet guns, field artillery, heavy howitzers, mortars, and rocket launchers fired into the German lines on the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive ridge east of Berlin. Those heights were only about 50 miles from the capital. Yet the artillery was so vast, so constant, that Berliners could sense it even from that distance. The far horizon pulsed red at night. The air carried a low, continuous rumble that didn't fade after a minute or an hour, but rolled through the darkness like a storm that refused to move on. For elderly Berliners, those sounds must have stirred old memories. Some had heard the guns of the First World War. Some had survived the hunger winters after 1918. Many had watched their sons march off in 1939 with confident faces and come home as wounded men, or not come home at all. Now, those same elders sat in cellars again, hearing a different kind of war announce itself, and knowing in their bones that this one was ending, not beginning. Inside Berlin, the government still tried to keep up appearances. Radio broadcasts spoke in polished tones about counterattacks and heroic resistance. Posters urged everyone to hold, to fight, to sacrifice. But the language felt thinner each day, like paper soaked too long in water. People listened without conviction. They had learned, painfully, that official words could not stop artillery. And even if the voices from above ground still tried to sound steady, the city itself was sliding toward panic. One of the cruelest things about siege, warfare, is that it forces ordinary people to become experts in survival overnight. Berliners weren't thinking about strategy or ideology now. They were thinking about water, about whether the bakery on the corner still had flour, about whether their cellar door could hold if the building above collapsed, about whether the man they loved was still alive in some street 3 blocks away, about how to keep a child calm when the walls were trembling. They organized their lives around what had become their true center of gravity, the underground. Cellars, subway tunnels, storage rooms beneath apartment blocks, even the deeper stations of the U-Bahn, these were no longer just spaces. They were shelters with their own rhythms. People arranged bunks from doors ripped off hinges. Families claimed corners with candles, quilts, and whatever possessions they had managed to keep. Someone always knew a neighbor who had a few potatoes. Someone always had a tin of coffee saved for a moment that felt like a holiday. Mothers quieted infants with soft songs that tried to cover the distant roar, and through it all, you could hear the new war approaching. The Soviets did not move blindly. Their assault was deliberate, layered, and heavy with experience. They had learned hard lessons in Stalingrad, Kursk, and hundreds of smaller fields and towns. They knew the Germans would defend Berlin desperately, and they understood that urban battle does not reward recklessness, so they prepared the way with fire. After Seelow cracked, the Soviet armies flowed westward, like water released from a dam. The lines of the Wehrmacht and SS were already frayed. The Volkssturm, brave in their own tragic way, could only delay, not stop. Soviet armor moved in columns down roads that were already littered with fleeing civilians and broken units. Their aircraft roamed the skies, striking transport routes, bridges, and retreating formations. Their infantry followed close behind, hardened men who had crossed rivers under fire and slept in snowdrifts for years. Many of them had been fighting since 1941. They were tired, but they were also relentless. In Berlin, the first visible consequences were felt before a single Soviet soldier entered the city. Refugees poured in from the east, bringing stories that were half rumor, half truth, and entirely terrifying. They spoke about villages swallowed by artillery, about Soviet tanks rolling through streets like iron beasts, about families separated on the road, about chaos and fear that felt like an unstoppable tide. These stories spread through Berlin's shelters like smoke. Whether they were exaggerated or not, they had one undeniable effect. They sharpened dread into something physical. People began to understand that the front was not some distant line on a map anymore. It was coming here. The city's defenders tried to shape the battlefield. Barricades went up quickly. There were no elegant fortifications now, no time for concrete bunkers. Berlin's defenses were improvised from the city's bones. Rubble was piled into mounds across main avenues. Streetcars were dragged sideways. Wrecked trucks were parked at angles to block travel. In some places, barricades rose 2 or 3 meters high. The idea was to funnel Soviet tanks into narrow lanes, where German anti-tank teams could ambush them. German soldiers and Volkssturm units dug firing positions into courtyards and parks. They placed machine guns behind broken windows. They wired stairwells with explosives. Snipers found roosts in shattered upper floors, where they could look down on streets that had turned into corridors of death. Mines were laid in parks, at crossroads, beneath debris that looked harmless to the untrained eye. Every doorway could now be a trap, every intersection a kill zone. But even as defenses thickened, so did the sense of fragility. Berlin was running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, sleep, hope. The city had become a fortress without supply lines. There was no longer a nation behind it to refill its lungs, only a shrinking pocket of desperation and a leadership that demanded miracles it could not deliver. In the final week of April, the artillery began to speak directly to Berlin. At first, it was intermittent shells landing in the eastern outskirts. Then, it became a rhythm. Then, it became a constant. Soviet guns, now close enough for direct fire, hammered the city's outer districts. Buildings shuddered. Roofs peeled away. Walls burst into dust. Windows, long since taped over or boarded up, exploded inward with every concussion. The psychological effect was immediate. There is a particular kind of fear that comes when you are shelled. It is not the same as the fear of gunfire. Gunfire feels selective, aimed, personal. Shelling feels indifferent. It does not care if you are a soldier or a mother or a child. It does not care if you have done wrong or right. It simply arrives. Berliners learned to tell shells apart by sound. The heavier rounds came with a deep, distant thump, like a giant striking the earth with a mallet. Rockets, those terrifying Katyusha salvos, arrived with a higher, screaming roar, 100 at once, followed by a rolling blast that felt like the sky was tearing. Mortar rounds were sharper, faster, closer. Each sound was a clue. Each clue was a warning. And warnings, in siege conditions, are everything. Inside shelters, people kept time by bombardment. Quiet now, someone would whisper during a lull. Maybe they're moving. Then, the next wave would arrive, and the candle flames would flicker sideways. Dust would fall from the ceiling. Children would squeeze their eyes shut. Adults would pretend they weren't afraid. Sometimes, fear did not express itself as screaming or crying. Sometimes it expressed itself as numbness. People sat on crates and looked at nothing. They listened with eyes half closed. They spoke in tired fragments. Some prayed, quietly. Some smoked constantly. Some tried to distract the children with stories about summers at lakes, about Christmases from years ago. Anything to keep that underground world feeling human. The hospitals, above and below ground, were already overwhelmed. Doctors worked without rest. Nurses used torn sheets for bandages. The wounded came in waves. Soldiers burned by explosions. Civilians crushed by collapsing walls. Children bleeding from shrapnel wounds gained just from being in the wrong room at the wrong moment. Operating rooms were sometimes in basements lit by lanterns. The smell of iodine mixed with dust and smoke and sweat. And still, the wounded kept coming. Every city has moments when it seems to hold its breath. Berlin in these days was doing the opposite. It was breathing in panic. On the streets, those who moved did so quickly, sticking close to walls, crossing open spaces in sudden dashes. Many had already learned that the safest route between two buildings wasn't the street, but the interior of adjacent structures, moving through broken hallways and blasted rooms like a maze. The city became a honeycomb of passageways. Neighbors who barely knew each other now shared stairwells, water buckets, and whispered warnings. And always, there was the knowledge that this was only the opening, because the true battle for Berlin had not yet begun. This was the tide arriving at the shoreline. The waves would be worse. As Soviet units pushed into the city's outer districts, Marzahn, Lichtenberg, Köpenick, and others, the first street battles began. These early clashes were brutal and disorienting. Soviet infantry advanced in tight coordination with tanks. Their armor pushed through roads choked with debris. Their men moved in disciplined wedges, clearing buildings with grenades and automatic fire. Their artillery bumped forward behind them, ready to pulverize any strongpoint that slowed the advance. German defenders fought in fragments. Some groups fought well, with local knowledge and a stubborn determination sharpened by the thought of family behind them. Others were thrown into battle with barely a rifle and a handful of rounds. The Volkssturm units, made up of boys and old men, often fought from positions that became death traps the moment Soviet guns found them. Anti-tank teams waited in ruins with Panzerfausts, short-range rocket weapons that were deadly up close. When a Soviet tank rolled into an intersection, they fired from windows or rubble piles, sometimes destroying the tank, sometimes dying instantly under Soviet return fire. These ambushes often turned streets into sudden infernos, metal screaming, fuel igniting, men running under dust and flame. Each block became its own war. The Soviets, for their part, adapted quickly to German tactics. If a barricade blocked a road, engineers moved in, clearing it under cover of smoke and tank fire. If a building was fortified, artillery would reduce it to rubble, and infantry would storm what was left. If snipers pinned down a street, tanks turned their guns upward and demolished the floors where the shots were coming from. It was methodical, harsh, and relentless. For Berlin's defenders, even small victories felt fleeting. A destroyed tank was a moral lift, but another column would arrive. A delayed Soviet advance bought time. But time toward what? Toward surrender? Toward escape? Toward death? No one could say clearly now, because the horizon of possibilities was shrinking by the hour. Civilians in the path of these first battles faced impossible choices. Some tried to flee westward through streets already under fire, risking shells, crossfire, and chaos. Others stayed underground, refusing to move because movement itself felt like a sentence. Some were caught in the open when their homes were hit, then staggered through smoke holding blankets over their heads, searching for any shelter that still stood. Many of these civilians were not thinking about politics anymore. They were thinking about survival in its simplest form: water, shelter, family, breath. And so in those early days of Berlin under direct assault, we see the city not yet at its climax but already changing shape. The outer ring of districts was becoming a furnace. The defenders were being pressed inward. The civilians were being forced deeper underground. The Soviet ring was tightening like a vice. The war had found its final room, and the door had shut behind it. When you are old enough, you learn that some moments cannot be stopped, only endured. The people of Berlin in April 1945, soldiers and civilians alike, were living inside such a moment. They had no power now to change the direction of history. They could only decide how to move through it, with fear, with courage, with numbness, with love, with whatever strength they could still find. And above them, the artillery never fully stopped. Chapter 3 ends here, not with resolution, but with the city fully inside the storm. The first thunder has landed. The outer streets are burning. The battle is no longer approaching. It is here. In our next chapter, we'll follow the Red Army as it drives deeper into Berlin, into the great avenues and narrow alleys, into the places where every doorway becomes a battlefield, and every step forward must be earned with blood. For now, take a slow breath with me. You are listening to Lullaby of Empires, and the story is moving, steadily, toward the heart of a collapsing world. Streets of ash. The Red Army enters the city. Berlin did not fall all at once. It did not collapse like a single wall, giving way. It fell the way a great, exhausted body gives up under fever, slowly, painfully, district by district, breath by breath. And as the Red Army pushed through the eastern edges, the city began to understand something terrible and simple. There would be no line beyond this one. No second Berlin. This was the last room. In the early hours after the outer defense belt cracked, Soviet forward units reached the first real neighborhoods of the capital. These were not places of marble and banners. They were working streets, tram lines, rows of apartment blocks, small courtyards where laundry once hung. Now they were gray and black with dust, their windows knocked out like teeth, their walls tattooed with shrapnel scars. The air tasted of smoke that never cleared. The ground was soft with pulverized brick. The Red Army entered Berlin in waves, infantry close to the armor, engineers close to the infantry, artillery close behind everything. Their advance was not reckless. It was practiced. They had crossed too many ruined cities to waste men without purpose. They moved with caution and weight, as if they were pressing a door inward and knew someone on the other side might still be holding it shut. By now, every Soviet soldier understood what Berlin meant. Not just the political meaning, though, that was immense, but the personal one. For 4 years they had marched across villages burned by retreating Germans, past towns where children had starved, through forests filled with mass graves. For many of these men, the war was not an abstract campaign. It was a trail of losses that had carved their lives into before and after. Now they were arriving at the source, the capital where the orders had begun. That knowledge made them grimly determined, but it also made them human, tired, hungry, furious, untrusting. A city is never captured only by strategy. It is captured by the emotional weight that soldiers bring with them. The Germans were waiting, not in a single wall, not in a clean line of trenches, but in pockets, in buildings that had become bunkers, in stairwells reinforced with sandbags, in courtyards where machine guns were set to rake the streets. This was defense by fracture, and the closer you got to the center, the more those fragments sharpened. At first, the Soviets met resistance at crossroads and strong points set along main avenues. A barricade would appear, not elegant but massive rubble piled shoulder high, tangled with wire, backed by a gun crew, or a Panzerfaust team positioned to ambush the first tank that dared to nose around it. A burned tram car might sit sideways across the road. A crater might yawn in the asphalt, turning a quiet street into a trap. Soviet tanks rolled forward anyway. They were dark and blunt against a pale, ruined city. Their engines were a constant growl, a kind of mechanical breathing. They moved slowly, because speed in a city can kill you. If a tank outruns its infantry, it becomes blind. And blindness, in Berlin, was fatal. So the infantry walked close, sometimes pressed against the tank's flanks, sometimes fanning outward into doorways and alleys. They moved in short bursts, then paused to listen. One soldier would cover a window while another crossed. One team would throw a grenade into a shattered room before stepping inside. There was no war of sweeping maneuvers anymore. It was a war of corners. The Germans used the city like a weapon. Snipers hid in upper floors, not always in clear positions, but in rooms opened by shell holes, firing from concealment and retreating through floor gaps to another part of the building. Machine gun teams positioned themselves to cover narrow corridors of street between ruins. Anti-tank hunters waited in basements, firing upward into thinner armor, or throwing bundled explosives from balconies. For the defenders, this terrain was all they had left. Their numbers were low. Their supplies were thinner each day. They had no air support and little artillery worth the name, but they had walls and rubble, and that rubble forced the Red Army to pay for every meter. In one district, a Soviet platoon might clear a street in an hour, only to be stopped at the next block by a nest of fire so stubborn that progress halts for half a day. Another Soviet unit might find a way around a barricade through the shell of a building, moving room to room until they spill into a courtyard behind German lines. Victory and danger were never far apart. They were sometimes the same moment. All of this unfolded while civilians remained inside the city, like people trapped inside a collapsing theater while the stage burns. In the eastern districts, some civilians had tried to flee before the final siege closed, but the roads were chaos. Bridges were under fire. People moved in streams that became targets. Many turned back. Others never returned. And those who stayed took shelter where they could under corners of intact staircases, deep in basement rooms, in subway tunnels where the air itself felt heavier each day. Their lives had shrunk into cycles. Wait for the barrage. Listen for a lull. Go upstairs to collect water from a broken pipe that still dripped if you were lucky. Retrieve food from a cupboard already half empty. Carry a neighbor's injured child to a cellar where someone claimed to have bandages. You did not plan for the future. You planned for the next hour. The sounds of battle were everywhere now. Not distant thunder, but sharp, immediate violence. You could hear a tank's cannon crack down the street. You could hear rifles snapping in the courtyard above. You could hear walls collapsing as if a giant had leaned his shoulder against them. You could hear someone screaming for a medic. You could hear footsteps pounding down stairs into the shelter. You could hear silence, those awful pockets of silence, when the firing paused long enough for your mind to fill in worse possibilities. For elderly Berliners, there were moments when the present must have blurred with memory. A creak in the ceiling might bring back a childhood night in 1918. The smell of smoke might revive the hunger winters that never truly left them. There is a particular loneliness in surviving two cataclysms in one lifetime. You begin to wonder if the world is ever truly safe, or if safety is simply a brief pause between storms. Yet even in that helplessness, people kept reaching for normality. Some still swept cellar floors, as if cleanliness were a tiny kind of control. Some still spoke softly of household routines, of gardens, of the taste of summer fruit. Some tried to keep children quiet with stories and songs. In the shelters, quiet became an act of kindness. If you could be calm, you could lend calmness to someone else. Above ground, the fighting chewed deeper. Soviet commanders pushed units along major avenues where armor could still move. The wide boulevards of Berlin, proud in peacetime, became channels for tanks. Yet those same boulevards were lined with solid stone buildings that defenders could turn into fortresses. So assault teams formed, infantry squads with flamethrowers, sappers with demolition charges, gunners with short-range weapons for clearing rooms. A building might be taken 3 times in one day. German defenders could be forced out from the front, then return through surrounding alleys, then be expelled again by a storm of grenades. The city's layout made lines fluid. Neither side could say with certainty that a street was safe. Safe meant only not under fire right now. And in the center of it all, logistics began to unravel on the German side. There was no steady line of supply anymore. Ammunition arrived in handfuls or not at all. Orders came down fractured channels. Runners were shot. Radios failed under rubble and interference. Units fought beside strangers because their old comrades were dead or separated. The Volkssturm, thrown into the line with little training, learned the rules of war in minutes and died by them in hours. On paper, Berlin was to be defended to the last. In reality, defense was a mosaic of tiny stands, some heroic, some desperate, some simply inevitable, because retreat was blocked by ruin or fear. The Red Army, by contrast, still had depth. If a unit was bled dry on one block, another could be brought in behind it. Their artillery, now closer, could be adjusted more precisely. Their tanks were numerous enough to rotate damaged ones out and push fresh ones forward. Their engineers worked constantly, clearing mines, filling craters, opening new routes through rubble. It wasn't endless strength. No army in April 1945 had endless strength, but it was more than the Germans could counter. In these days, there was a strange kind of duality in Berlin. On one hand, everything was collapsing. On the other, everything was intensely alive. The city had become a maze of moments sharpened to their edge. A soldier who had survived 4 years could die in 10 seconds ascending a stairwell. A mother who had hidden safely for a week could be killed stepping outside for water. A child could be found alive under a collapsed wall, blinking at a rescuer like a child waking from a nightmare. Life and death were no longer events. They were neighbors. The Soviets advanced, but not without cost. Urban combat devours armies. Tanks are strong in open fields. In cities, they become prey unless they move with infantry. Buildings offer defenders height and concealment. Every room can be a trap, every cellar a tunnel to an ambush. The Red Army knew this. Their tactics were careful, but even careful tactics could not prevent steep casualties. Men fell in stairwells, in courtyards, in smoking hallways so narrow they could not bring full weapons to bear. Entire squads were erased by booby-trapped doorways, and still they moved. Because their mission was now almost sacred, they were not only seizing territory, they were ending something that had consumed their country. Berlin was not just a city ahead of them. It was the final proof of victory behind them. As days passed, Soviet footholds expanded into more districts. Reinforcements poured through the breaches. German pockets were isolated as Soviet units pressed between them. You could see the shape of the battle changing. Instead of a single push, it became many small thrusts that met and linked, like closing fingers, forming a tightening ring toward the center. In the wake of those thrusts, civilians emerged slowly, cautiously, like people stepping out after a hurricane and finding the world rearranged. Some came up in daylight to search for water or family. Some waved white cloths in windows. Some simply stood in the streets in silence. Many were too exhausted to be anything but still. You could see it in their faces, the hollow fatigue of people who have carried fear too long. Soviet soldiers, entering these streets, saw not a defeated enemy but a ruined civilian world. Their responses were not uniform. Some were compassionate, offering bread or directing people to safer routes. Others were suspicious, hardened by years of betrayal and ambush. War makes empathy difficult. It also makes it complicated. But even complicated empathy mattered, because at some point in any battle, people stop being abstract. A soldier sees an old woman with no shoes. A mother sees a soldier as a boy who might have once been her son. A war that has flattened nations suddenly narrows into a single gaze across a ruined street. Night in Berlin carried its own dread. The fires made the darkness flicker. The smoke turned moonlight into a dim smear. The city glowed in places like a coal bed stirred by wind. Combat did not stop at night. It shifted. German defenders often used darkness to slip between positions, to launch sudden counterattacks on Soviet flanks. Soviet units sometimes paused to regroup, then surged forward again under cover of artillery flashes. Light came not from street lamps but from explosions. Shadows moved unnaturally. Sleep came only in fragments. Down in shelters, people listened to the night war above them. Sometimes they could tell which side was closer by the rhythm of the firing. Sometimes they could taste fresh dust and know the building had been struck again. Sometimes they simply waited, hands clasped, hoping for a morning that still existed. And yet, dawn always came. Even in ruin, Berlin saw sunrises. Even in catastrophe, clocks still ticked somewhere. The war had reduced the city to rubble, but it had not stopped time. By the end of these opening days inside Berlin, the Red Army held large sections of the eastern and southeastern districts. The German defense had been forced backward toward the center. The ring around the government quarter was still wide, but everyone could see it tightening. Berlin's great avenues, once meant for parades, were now funnels for tanks. Its proud buildings, once symbols of order, were now cliffs of rubble. Its people, once busy and ordinary, were now survivors, living in a city that had become the last chapter of a war and the first chapter of a different world. Chapter 4 closes here with the Red Army firmly inside the capital, the battle turning fully into a citywide struggle. In the next chapter, we'll follow the fighting as it spreads westward into denser neighborhoods, across canals and railway lines, toward the districts that would decide the fate of the government heart itself. The city tightens, encirclement and the fracturing of Berlin. If Chapter 4 was the moment Berlin first felt the Red Army's breath on its streets, then Chapter 5 is when the city realized that breath would not pull back. It would only come closer, steady, patient, impossible to bargain with. The battle did not rush like a flood. It advanced like winter, sealing doors, hardening rivers, narrowing every possible path until movement itself became surrender. By the third week of April 1945, Soviet forces had entered Berlin in multiple thrusts. The eastern approaches were no longer front line. They were Soviet rear areas now, filled with ammunition columns, field kitchens, medics, and engineers working under intermittent fire. The war had shifted inward. Berlin's outer shell had cracked, and what was being fought over now was the inside of the fruit. The Soviet plan relied on pressure from several directions at once. It was a method shaped by experience. Stalingrad remembered, Warsaw studied, Budapest absorbed. In each city, they had learned that urban battles are fought not only with strength, but with coordination. Large formations split into smaller combined arms groups, infantry to clear rooms, tanks to dominate streets, engineers to open routes, artillery to grind strongpoints down into manageable dust. It was less a single wave and more a vast net that tightened as it moved. German commanders understood what that meant, and they also understood something worse. They could not stop it. Their defensive map looked impressive on paper. Strongpoints had been prepared for months. Barricades were layered. Anti-tank positions were chosen to exploit choke points. Yet, the city's defenders were already running on fumes. Some units were hardened veterans, yes, but many were not teenagers with Panzerfausts, elderly men pressed into Volkssturm battalions, naval cadets fighting as infantry, staff clerks suddenly holding rifles. A defense can survive a lack of numbers if it has time. Berlin had neither. Still, the resistance was real. It was painful. It was sometimes terrifyingly effective in small places. Every new district the Red Army entered forced a recalculation. Berlin was not a flat landscape, but a knot of architecture. Wide boulevards that invited armor forward, narrow side streets that swallowed it, stone apartment blocks that offered defenders protection, open squares that offered attackers fields of fire. The Soviets tended to push along main arteries because tanks needed room to move. But in doing so, they were often funneled into the places defenders had prepared, like traps, intersections thick with mines, barricades reinforced with rubble, firing positions hidden behind twisted metal and broken tram cars. For a Soviet soldier, a street in Berlin was not a street. It was a corridor of danger. He walked with his shoulders hunched without noticing. He listened for that particular silence that comes before an ambush. He watched windows the way sailors watch waves. Every doorway was a mouth that could spit fire. Every upper floor was a perch for a sniper. Even the fallen rubble could hide a hand with a grenade. The city was alive with hiding places. Red Army assault groups moved methodically. A block would be approached. 2 men might dash to the first doorway while the rest covered them. A grenade would be thrown into a room before a boot crossed the threshold. Tanks would fire into suspected positions, not to destroy buildings entirely, but to eliminate the eyes and guns that lived inside them. Then the infantry climbed into stairwells with the awkward, cautious speed of people who know patience is life. German defenders adapted in their own ways. They learned quickly that holding entire streets was impossible. Instead, they tried to make each capture expensive. A barricade might be left lightly manned at the front, but thickly trapped behind. A sniper might draw Soviets into a building, where another team waited in the basement with explosives. Small counterattacks, timed at dusk or after a barrage, could briefly retake a courtyard or a stairwell. These were not strategies for victory. They were strategies for time. And time, for the Germans, had become a kind of prayer. At the center of this defense sat a chilling directive: hold Berlin at all costs. No retreat, no negotiation. The city was to become a symbol, and symbols do not surrender politely. That order came down from Hitler in the bunker, but by now, his command had become less a chain and more a hiss of static. Communication was fraying. Cables were cut by shellfire. Radios failed inside thick stone. Runners ran and did not return. A commander might receive a message hours late telling him to maintain the line, at a line that no longer existed. A unit might fight alone for a proselyt's day, not realizing the neighboring battalion had already vanished. The defense was becoming a series of islands. Soviet advances pierced between them. A brigade would push through an industrial corridor, while another swept a parallel residential street. The Germans would hold a factory block. The Soviets would take the apartments behind it. The Germans would still be firing to their front, while the Red Army was already filtering around their flanks. One morning, a German unit could wake to find that every road out of its district was now Soviet-controlled. Encirclement didn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrived with the quiet absence of options. For civilians, encirclement was felt not as a map, but as a shrinking world. Berliners had been conditioned for war for years. They knew blackout routines, ration queues, air raid shelters, but nothing had prepared them for the city itself becoming a sealed storm. Once the Soviet ring closed, movement turned deadly. You might try to find water and never return. You might step into a stairwell to check on a neighbor and find a Red Army squad coming up the same stairs. The war was no longer something that passed overhead. It was in the hallway. Families learned to live in deep places. Basements grew crowded with strangers who became neighbors by necessity. People arranged sleeping spaces on broken furniture, shawls tied into makeshift curtains, bread sliced thinner each day. Some children no longer cried because crying took energy they didn't have. Mothers learned to hush in ways that were almost musical. A hand on a cheek, a whisper of a lullaby that pretended the earth above was not tearing itself apart. Older Berliners, those who had lived long enough to remember another ruin, often became the quiet centers of these shelters. They spoke less. They watched more. They had seen fear before, and they understood that fear feeds on imagination. So they offered routine, a share of water, a calm voice, a soft instruction. In war, the elderly often become a kind of anchor without being asked. Above them, the Red Army pushed on. Artillery played an enormous part. The Soviets did not simply blast indiscriminately, though the results could appear that way to a civilian eye. Their gunners were increasingly careful. Berlin was a city they expected to occupy, and there were roads and bridges they needed intact. Fire was often brought down in short, focused storms, aimed at strong points identified by reconnaissance or by the sudden, punishing crack of German machine guns. You would hear a building breathe out dust after a direct hit. Then for a moment the street would be still, and Soviet infantry would come forward again. The effect on defenders was crushing. To hold a position under artillery in a city is to live in constant vibration. Walls shake, plaster falls in little clouds. Your ears become a permanent ringing instrument. Your muscles stay clenched, even when you don't notice. And then, after the blast, the badge, street fight returns the close. Intimate violence of rifles, grenades, bayonets, shouting in languages that carry different kinds of fear. German morale began to split along lines of experience. Veterans clung to discipline. SS units, tied to ideology and fear of retribution, often fought with ferocity, even when logic said, stop. Volkssturm militia, by contrast, was a wave of individual reactions. Some fought hard because home was behind them. Some collapsed quickly because their bodies knew better than their orders. Some surrendered in small groups when they realized no one was coming to help. A surrender in Berlin could be quiet, almost private. A man would step from a doorway with his hands raised. Another would follow. A third would toss his weapon into the rubble with a clatter that sounded too loud in the circumstances. There were no speeches, just breathing. The Red Army took prisoners methodically, disarmed them, moved them rearward. The machine of victory kept turning. Yet in between these moments, the Germans still hurt the Soviets. Anti-tank teams could be devastating. A single Panzerfaust, launched from a corner, could turn a Soviet tank into a burning metal coffin. Snipers could stall an entire advance if they were clever, forcing Soviets to comb building after building to locate them. Mines were everywhere. Booby traps too. Some were crude, some were ingenious. A stairwell might be rigged to collapse when weight hit the middle landing. A door frame might hide explosives that triggered when opened. Urban warfare is a language of deception, and in Berlin, deception was constant. Soviet infantry therefore moved with a practiced suspicion. They did not trust silence. They did not trust empty rooms. They did not trust even the dead. Sappers went first often, probing rubble with bayonets, checking wires, marking mines with chalk or flags. This was slow work. It saved lives. It also exhausted lives. The battle required endless attention. Across the city, one could feel the tightening ring. The Soviets were now pressing toward the Spree River crossings, toward rail yards, toward the vast Tiergarten areas that opened the way into the governmental core. They did not need to take everything at once. They needed to keep moving. The Germans could delay them in places, but they could not reverse the flow. Every day, Soviet units pushed a little further. Every day, German units shrank into a smaller radius. Maps in Soviet command posts began to look like a closing fist. In German command posts, maps began to look like an erosion, and within the Führerbunker, that erosion was still denied. Orders still came down insisting on counterattacks that no longer had fuel, men, or roads. Reality above had become a different planet. Yet the bunker continued to send its gravity outward, insisting the city was strong when it was fractured, insisting relief was coming when it was not. For some German defenders, this denial became a form of madness they could not afford. They chose pragmatic survival. For others, denial became religion. They fought with the pure intensity of those who believe defeat is worse than death. It is important to understand this, not to excuse it, but to grasp the texture of the battle. Human beings do not behave uniformly under collapse. Berlin was a prism for every kind of response. Meanwhile, the civilian world continued to crumble in practical ways. Water was failing. Electrical power was sporadic. Food stocks were gone or hidden. Fires burned uncontrolled because no one had the strength or the supplies to fight them. Corpses lay in streets because retrieval meant risk, and the risk meant death. Disease began to whisper at the edges. And yet, in this ruin, people still did astonishingly ordinary things. A woman might scrape soot from a kettle to boil water anyway. A father might search a courtyard for a lost child and return with him under his coat. A neighbor might share a last potato with a stranger. These tiny acts are not footnotes to history. They are history's heartbeat. At times, the war forced strange meetings. A Soviet squad would enter a building expecting resistance and find only an elderly couple in a cellar. The couple might not even look up at first, too exhausted to react. The soldiers might search, then leave quietly, their boots echoing up the stairs. The couple would sit in the half-darkness afterward, unsure if what had happened was real. In many Berlin homes, the moment of occupation came not with drama but with silence. There were also moments of terror, of course, but this chapter is about a city tightening into its end, and within that tightening, there is a kind of tragic calm. The battle's outcome was no longer in question, only its price. As the Soviets advanced, they began to link sectors of conquest. A district taken by one army met the edge of a district taken by another. Their lines connected. The net drew in. German pockets were sealed from each other. Some tried to break out westward. Many failed. Some disappeared into the rubble and fought on without even knowing their city was already lost. By late April, Berlin's fate had become a certainty on every level except ideological one. The war had moved from, "Can we hold?" to "How long can we delay?" and then to "What will be left when it ends?" And still, the Red Army moved. Not quickly, not gracefully, but like a tide that does not argue with sandcastles. Their combined arms method was relentless. Their manpower was still vast. Their artillery still spoke heavier languages than German guns could answer. Their morale, despite fatigue and grief, came from a hard-earned knowledge. The war was finally ending, and it would end here. When darkness fell over Berlin in these days, there was less illusion in the air. The fires still burned. The guns still sounded. But there was a new undertone beneath it all, like the lower note of a funeral hymn. The city was being gathered into the Ansars, final act. You can imagine the feel of the stones underfoot, the way the air must have stung the eyes, the taste of dust on the tongue, the fatigue in arms that had lifted rifles for weeks, the aching in backs that had slept on concrete. One could not breathe without inhaling history. By the close of Chapter 5, the Red Army had not yet reached the Reich Chancellery or Hitler's bunker. But it was close enough now that even the ground seemed to know. The encirclement was nearly complete. Berlin was no longer a capital defending itself. It was a tightening circle of resistance around a dying center. In the next chapter, the battle will deepen into its most intimate form, house to house, cellar to cellar. We will step into the dense districts where every apartment becomes a fortress and every staircase a front line. This is where cities are not taken by sweeping armies, but by exhausted men with grenades and flashlights moving through rooms that still smell faintly of home. House to house, the struggle for Berlin's key districts. By the time Chapter 6 begins, Berlin is no longer a city with a front. It is a city made of fronts. The old idea of a continuous defensive line has collapsed into something far more intimate and far more frightening. Tiny clenched battles scattered across neighborhoods like sparks in dry grass. Every block holds its own war. Every building has its own fate. The Soviet ring had tightened in the previous days, and now the Red Army pressed inward with the confidence of an army that has seen this pattern before. From the east and the southeast, through the battered industrial districts and along the rail lines, they moved steadily toward the heart. From the north and the south, other formations advanced along rubble-choked streets, converging like the closing hands of a vice. The geography of Berlin dictated the rhythm of this advance. Wide avenues invited armor to lead. Narrow residential lanes demanded infantry first. The city itself decided how fast men lived or died. In the Soviet assault groups, there was a kind of grim professionalism. The men were exhausted, yet the movements were practiced. They had learned in earlier cities that urban warfare punishes carelessness. No one walked upright in open streets unless forced. No one entered a doorway without suspicion. The young soldiers who had once rushed forward under slogans now moved with the cautious patience of men who had watched friends vanish in stairwells or behind shattered walls. The Germans waited for them in a city turned into a maze. Residential blocks 3, 4, 5 stories high, their facades torn open by bomb and shell, had become miniature fortresses. Staircases were blocked by furniture and rubble. Courtyards were sown with tripwires. Snipers occupied upper floors where the best sightlines remained. Machine gun teams treated intersections like hunting grounds, sweeping their fire low across streets to catch anyone who tried to cross. And behind these positions stood a defense made of a strange mixture of people: hardened Wehrmacht remnants, SS formations driven by ideological fear, and Volkssturm militia that looked, in many cases, like the old and the almost child. It is hard to imagine a more uneven contest. Yet uneven contests often produce the fiercest resistance, because resistance becomes less about strategy and more about survival, pride, and terror of what comes next. Many defenders believed surrender meant death. Others believed surrender meant shame. Some believed surrender meant abandoning their families. And some simply could not think beyond the next hour. So they fought. The Soviet approach to these districts relied on combined arms, but on a scale adapted to the city's narrowness. A typical assault might begin with reconnaissance scouts creeping forward, peering through broken doorways, listening for German movement. If a strong point was found, artillery or mortars were called in. But the bombardment was not always prolonged. Berlin was already a skeleton. Heavy shells could turn rubble into walls that stopped Soviet tanks. So fire was applied in bursts enough to break a position, not enough to seal the street entirely. Then the infantry moved. They advanced in small groups, often no larger than a platoon, because larger formations became targets. 2 squads might enter neighboring buildings at once. One cleared floor by floor, hurling grenades into rooms before stepping in. Rifles held close. The other provided cover from windows, firing at any movement across the street. Tanks rumbled behind them when space allowed, pushing cautiously along main roads, their guns trained ahead like blind men, feeling the air with their hands. Engineers walked close to these tanks, probing for mines and cutting through wire. The whole process was slow, grinding, and deadly in its intimacy. For the defenders, the battle felt like a room shrinking. A German machine gunner might hold his position for hours, his barrel smoking, his shoulders numbed by recoil. He might hear the Russians coming up the stairwell below and throw a grenade down the steps, hoping to delay them another minute. He might be joined by a Volkssturm boy carrying spare magazines, pale and shaking, trying to look brave. A commander might move between positions with a pistol in hand, issuing orders that were half command and half pleading. And all the while shells fell. Walls cracked, floors sagged. The air reeked of plaster dust, cordite, and smoke. This was not a battle that moved in grand sweeps. It moved in inches. A single apartment block might cost dozens of lives. A staircase could become a grave marker. A basement could hold out for hours and then be taken in moments. The front lines were less lines and more shifting stains. One of the most punishing realities of house-to-house combat is the way it erases the difference between attack and defense. A room taken at noon might be lost by evening. A courtyard cleared at dawn might be contested again by nightfall. Control of a building did not mean safety. It meant responsibility. Every newly captured space had to be secured, watched, guarded against the inevitable counterfire from a neighboring structure. The city was full of flanks. There was no such thing as a rear in the normal sense. The role of engineers' sappers became almost heroic in its relentlessness. These men crawled forward under fire, their tools simple but their courage immense. They cut booby traps. They dismantled mines. They blew holes through walls to allow Soviet infantry to move between buildings without crossing exposed streets. In a city like Berlin, a wall was not a barrier. It was a doorway waiting to be forced. The Germans responded with desperate creativity. They built barricades from tram cars and stone. They created firing slits through thick apartment walls. They used sewer passages and subway tunnels to slip fighters behind Soviet lines, emerging suddenly in a courtyard to fire from unexpected angles. Anti-tank teams became hunters, waiting at corners with Panzerfausts, listening for the metallic grind of Soviet tracks. When a tank appeared, they fired at close range, sometimes dying immediately after, but sometimes leaving a Soviet crew burning inside steel. Each of these small victories mattered locally, but they could not alter the overall direction of the battle. The Red Army had too much mass, too much firepower, too much momentum. For every Soviet squad pinned down, another came around a side street. For every tank destroyed, another rolled into the avenue behind it. For every German counterattack, another Soviet artillery concentration answered within minutes. The Soviet advantage was not just numbers, it was organization. Their communication, though strained by rubble and static, was still stronger than the Germans. Forward observers adjusted fire rapidly. Liaison officers moved between units. Radios crackled with rough voices, issuing clear, practical orders. The German communications, by contrast, were becoming whispers in a storm. Runners were killed. Telephones were dead. Commanders shouted orders across streets as if trying to talk through thunder. Some defensive pockets fought in near-total isolation, unaware that the neighboring district had already fallen. Within this environment, civilians endured a kind of nightmare that cannot be measured simply in physical terms. Most were hiding now, not moving unless forced. Basements filled with families whose names did not matter anymore, only their shared need to live. The normal rhythms of daily life had been crushed into a single rhythm. Wait, listen, survive. The elderly sat in corners or on broken chairs, conserving strength. Mothers cradled children that had grown too quiet. Men, those not conscripted or already dead, turned into providers of the smallest things. Water carried from dangerous streets, bits of food scavenged from ruined kitchens, wood broken from shattered doors to make a small fire. Fear was everywhere, but so was a strange, stubborn resilience. People learned quickly where shells tended to fall. They learned which stairwells still held, which walls shook too much to trust. They traded information in murmurs, like old neighbors sharing gardening tips in a darkened cellar. In some shelters, someone would try to keep a routine, offering a prayer, telling a story, calming others with a voice that insisted tomorrow might still exist. Sometimes, civilians were pulled into the defense. A Volkssturm unit might ask for help carrying ammunition up a stairwell. A barricade might need hands. A wounded man might be dragged into a basement where a woman tore sheets to make bandages. These moments blurred the boundary between combatant and non-combatant in ways that made the city feel even more dangerous. When the war is in your staircase, neutrality becomes a luxury you cannot always afford. In the key districts, the fighting thickened. Railway stations were fought over like precious stones. Whoever controlled them controlled movement, supply, and the symbolic backbone of a modern city. Industrial plants huge, skeletal halls of metal and brick became killing grounds. Their wide interiors allowed machine gun fields of fire, and their heavy construction resisted shelling longer than residential blocks. Government buildings in the outer administrative zones were defended with particular stubbornness because they carried the weight of ideology even when ideology was crumbling. Soviet commanders focused on these objectives deliberately. Capturing them did not merely win streets, it won velocity. It allowed new supply corridors to open into the city. It allowed artillery to move forward. It tightened the net again. The Red Army pressed not randomly but purposefully, aiming to reduce German defense into ever smaller fragments. And as those fragments shrank, their resistance became more erratic, sometimes more terrifying. A corner held by SS troops might fight to the last man. Another held by Volkssturm might surrender at first contact. A Wehrmacht officer might try to organize a coherent withdrawal to a new building, only to find the streets between already occupied by Soviets. The city produced sudden collapses and sudden ferocities. No one could predict which door would open to a surrendering teenager and which would open to a grenade. The psychological toll on soldiers on both sides was immense. Urban war is a kind of constant intrusion. There is no open field where danger can be seen coming. There is only the snap of a rifle from a window you didn't notice, the sudden, concussive blast of a booby trap, the whistling approach of shells that could fall anywhere. Soviet troops, battle-hardened though they were, felt the grinding strain of this unpredictability. They slept in short bursts, if they slept at all. They fought through narrow hallways that smelled like smoke and old cooking. They stepped over bodies in stairwells and kept moving, because stopping meant dying. German defenders lived in a different psychological trap. Many of them knew the city was lost. They heard it in rumors, in the direction of the guns, in the absence of any meaningful reinforcement. Yet they were ordered to fight anyway. Some fought out of faith, some fought out of fear. Some fought because there was nowhere to go. A man who holds a rifle in a collapsing city is not always guided by ideology. Often he is guided by the simplest instinct. Not here, not now, not yet. The battle's tempo slowed, not because the Soviets were failing, but because urban war always slows the stronger side. You cannot sweep a city the way you sweep a field. You must clear it, and clearing takes time. But the direction remained unstoppable. By mid to late April, Soviet troops had secured more districts, and German resistance was increasingly broken into pockets stubborn, sometimes savage, but isolated. The city's center still held, but only because it was the last place left to hold. Every hour that passed brought the Red Army closer to the government quarter. Every street taken was a step toward the Reichstag, the Chancellery, the bunker. The war was narrowing to its final stage. The city itself had become a crucible, a place where modern warfare met human endurance face to face, without distance to soften it. Berlin's boulevards and stairwells were no longer architecture. They were arguments between life and death. They were the last pages of a regime written in rubble. And as Chapter 6 closes, what is clearest is not just that Berlin is falling, but how it is falling. Not in a single dramatic collapse, but in 1,000 violent, intimate encounters, each fought over a kitchen, a landing, a cellar door. The battle is becoming smaller in geography, but larger in meaning. The closer one moves toward the center, the heavier history becomes. In the next chapter, we will enter that center more directly. The government district will draw into view, not yet as a captured prize, but as a looming fortress of stone, concrete, and desperation. The streets ahead will not be ordinary streets, but symbolic corridors leading toward the final heartbeat of the Third Reich. For now, Berlin still fights in rooms and ruins, but the walls are closing. The siege of the government district, approaching the Reich Chancellery. By late April 1945, Berlin had changed its shape in the minds of those fighting for it. It was no longer a city of neighborhoods and streets. It was a destination, a final knot in the war that had to be untied, one building at a time. And at the center of that knot stood the government district, the symbolic heart of the Third Reich, and the place where the last decisions were being made beneath the ground. The Red Army's advance had been steady, but the closer it came to the center, the stranger the landscape became. Berlin's outer districts had been battered by years of bombing and days of shell fire. But the inner government area was different. It was the stage on which Nazi power had performed its greatest illusions. And now, those grand avenues, ministries, and monuments were being converted into the last fortress. The Chancellery, the Reichstag, the ministries along Wilhelmstrasse, and the bridges that fed into the district were not just strategic targets. They were trophies, and they were wounds, places where the war's meaning would be written in concrete and blood. The Soviet command understood this fully. Their soldiers may have been thinking about simple things, water, rest, the next street corner, but the men directing them knew that the capture of this district would echo far beyond the battlefield. It would be photographed, reported, remembered. It would become the image of victory. And because of that, the assault was both practical and deliberate, carried out with a careful pressure that never let go. The German High Command understood it too, though their understanding was soaked in denial. Hitler was still beneath the Reich Chancellery, in the bunker that had become his last world. His orders were increasingly frantic, increasingly disconnected from reality, but they were still orders. The district was to be held at all costs. It was to be defended to the last man. It was to be the place where Germany's fate would turn, not because it could turn, but because the regime needed to believe it could. In the streets above, those orders translated into fortifications layered on top of ruin. Barricades made from stone, overturned vehicles, and twisted girders were stacked across avenues. Anti-tank guns were hidden behind the rubble of collapsed facades. Snipers waited in ministry windows and the upper floors of ruined apartments. Machine guns were planted where they could rake broad streets and funnel attackers into kill zones. Mines were scattered in courtyards and along sidewalks, sometimes marked, sometimes not. And the underground spaces, the subways, the service tunnels, the basements that connected whole blocks became shadow routes where defenders could move unseen, and where civilians could hide with no clear idea whether safety existed anywhere at all. The defenders themselves were a cross-section of collapse. There were still disciplined units, SS guards, remnants of the Wehrmacht, some police formations, but there were also Volkssturmboys gripping rifles too heavy for their shoulders, and older men who had been handed armbands and told to stand where they were placed. Many had no meaningful training for the kind of war they now faced, yet training mattered less the closer the battle came to the center. In this district, men fought because there was nowhere left to retreat to. The Soviet approach to the government district was not a single punch, but a tightening circle. Their assault groups, infantry, supported by tanks, and engineers pushed in multiple directions at once, seeking to collapse the defenders inward rather than letting them regroup behind new lines. Artillery was shifted forward whenever streets were cleared enough to drag guns through. Mortars and rockets were used with a grim efficiency, pounding strongpoints before infantry moved in. And above them, Soviet aircraft and reconnaissance units watched for patterns. Where defenders fired from, where barricades were thickest, where a sudden quiet meant either surrender or a trap. Yet nothing about this advance felt smooth. It was slow for the same reason that all city fighting is slow, because every building must be taken as if it were a fortress, and every alley might hold death. The wide boulevards near the government quarter looked like highways in a map room, but on the ground, they were seas of debris and smoke. A tank could lead an advance there, yes, but only if engineers had cleared mines and if snipers had been silenced in advance. A single anti-tank team with a Panzerfaust could ruin an entire assault column at a corner. So Soviet tanks moved like cautious beasts, stopping often, firing into windows suspected of hiding defenders, then crawling forward again. Infantry hugged walls, moved in short dashes, and entered buildings as though they were stepping into a throat. Imagine a Soviet squad reaching a ministry complex. The outer walls are scorched, windows blown out. The entrance hall is dark and full of dust. The men move in layered formation, two forward, one covering the stairwell, another watching the corridor. A grenade is tossed into a side room before anyone enters. A shout in Russian echoes through shattered marble. Somewhere above, a German rifle cracks. A Soviet soldier falls, and the rest keep moving, because stopping would add bodies to the hall. The building is cleared floor by floor, each stairwell fought over like a ridgeline. When the top floor is taken, the squad posts watchers in windows, knowing the fight is not over, that the neighboring building might still fire across the street, and that tonight the Germans might try to slip back through a basement link. This was the rhythm of the siege. Slow, brutal, methodical. The German defenders, for their part, fought with a stubbornness sharpened by symbolism. Many believed that if the government district fell, everything fell. In their minds, it was the last wall between their world and the enemy's world. So some fought to the death in offices that had once written decrees. Some held stairwells and corridors long after they were outflanked, simply because a corridor was all they had left to hold. And some, especially among the Volkssturm, surrendered when they saw the first Soviet infantry appear in the smoky light. Their surrender was not cowardice. It was the simple, silent calculation of survival in a war already decided. But surrender was complicated by fear. Nazi propaganda had long painted the Soviets as monsters. Stories, some exaggerated, some brutally real, flowed through Berlin's shelters. Fear made men fight longer than reason would demand, and fear made civilians tremble even when liberation was near. In the government district, fear was a weapon as potent as any mortar, because it kept the defenders tied to a hopeless cause, and the civilians trapped between two terrors: the terror of the collapsing regime and the terror of the unknown future. The civilians here were living on the edge of the battlefield more literally than anywhere else. Many had been evacuated earlier in the war, but tens of thousands remained, hiding in cellars beneath ministries, in subway stations, in gardens torn by shell fire. Those sheltering closest to the district's core heard everything: the rumble of tanks, the screams in stairwells, the sudden thunderclap of artillery. In the bunker-like basements of official buildings, civilians shared space with soldiers passing through or retreating downward. The line between civilian refuge and military position blurred until it was no line at all. Some civilians tried to flee, but fleeing in Berlin's center was like trying to cross a storm. Streets were under fire, bridges were destroyed or guarded. Every open space was a killing ground. A family might dash across a street after a lull, only to be caught by renewed small arms fire. An elderly couple might decide to stay in their cellar because moving was riskier than waiting. Children were kept silent, not because silence could stop shells, but because silence was the last remaining control adults had. The government district's architecture intensified the battle. The ministries were thick, metalled buildings with concrete cores designed to impress and endure. They could withstand heavy bombardment longer than residential blocks, which meant defenders could survive longer within them. Their wide halls also meant that once Soviets got inside, fights became close, and indistinct men firing down corridors lined with broken statues and fallen plaster, using doorways as cover, pushing forward by inches. The Reichstag itself loomed to the west like a stone beast, already scarred and half-ruined, but still tall enough to become a magnet for both hope and dread. Everyone knew where the war was heading now. Everyone knew which buildings mattered most. Soviet commanders adapted in real time. When an avenue proved too lethal for tanks, they sent infantry through parallel streets, smashing through walls to bypass kill zones. When a ministry complex resisted shelling, they brought up heavier guns or moved assault groups into its flanks. Their strength was not only in numbers, but in willingness to adjust. Berlin's defenders, by contrast, were adjusting too, but always backward, always in confusion, always with fewer men and fewer weapons. Counterattacks still occurred, sometimes fierce, sometimes almost tragic. A group of SS troops might charge from a side street and briefly cut into a Soviet advance before being swallowed by artillery fire. A Volkssturm unit might try to hold a barricade until it was simply vaporized by tank guns. These were not maneuvers intended to win the battle. They were maneuvers intended to purchase time. and time was now the most precious resource in Berlin, not because it could change the outcome, but because it postponed the moment of surrender, the moment of reckoning, the moment of the unknown. Communication inside the government district frayed further each day. The Soviets maintained link-ups by radio and runners. They had trained for this kind of coordination. But the Germans had almost no functional network left. Orders from the bunker were delayed or never arrived. Officers on the surface argued over what to do with units they could barely locate. A commander might send men to reinforce a position only to discover that position had already fallen 2 hours earlier. In the fog of rubble and smoke, confusion became its own enemy. Medical conditions were nightmarish. Field stations had to be set in basements or improvised rooms. Supplies were thin. Wounded men lay on stair landings, waiting for stretcher bearers to reach them through incoming fire. Civilians with injuries from collapsing buildings or stray bullets were treated beside soldiers in the same makeshift spaces. Nurses and medics worked with hands that were shaking from exhaustion and shock. Many in this district died not from dramatic wounds, but from the slow cruelty of infection, hunger, and the impossibility of evacuation. And still, the Soviet advance continued. By the time this chapter reaches its late April close, the Red Army had secured critical footholds around the government district's outer approaches. The defenders were increasingly cut into isolated nodes. A ministry here, a street corner there, an underground pocket somewhere else. The city center was becoming an archipelago of resistance surrounded by Soviet sea. The pressure was not easing, it was tightening. For Berlin's defenders, the government district was now less a fortress and more a trap. Every retreat led closer to the same doomed center. Every barricade built was one fewer exit. The symbolic heart of Nazi Germany was becoming its coffin. For the Soviets, success was measured not in dramatic leaps, but in the quiet, relentless arithmetic of urban war. One building, one block, one bridge at a time. Their combined arms method, artillery to break, infantry to clear, armor to support, engineers to open the way, was proving unstoppable when applied with patience. And for the civilians, the siege felt like the end of time. Their world had shrunk into underground rooms and whispered prayers. They could not know what tomorrow would bring: relief, revenge, survival, loss. But they knew one thing with certainty: the sounds above were moving closer. In the next chapter, those sounds will collide with the district's core. The Reich, Chancellery, and the bunker beneath it will no longer be distant objectives. They will become the battlefield itself. The final act will begin not with a single trumpet blast, but with the same grinding footstep that has carried this war into Berlin's last streets. The final Soviet assault, storming the Reich Chancellery and the Führerbunker. The last days of April did not arrive in Berlin with a clear border. There was no single moment when the government district began to fall. Instead, the fall crept forward like dusk, street by street, hall by hall, until suddenly the heart of the city was surrounded by fire and footsteps. The Red Army had tightened its grip around the central quarter, and now its soldiers stood within sight of the buildings that had once seemed untouchable. The Reich Chancellery was no longer a symbol far ahead on a map. It was a wall in front of them, a ruin that still breathed resistance, and beneath it, a bunker where the remnants of a regime waited for the end. The government district looked like a city inside a city, but now it was a cratered ring of shattered stone. Wide avenues had become long channels of debris. The lawns and gardens that once framed Nazi ceremonies were gouged by shellfire. The air held a constant haze of dust and smoke, so thick that daylight felt filtered and evening felt endless. The Soviet advance had reached the district's lip, and commanders knew that what came next would be the most costly part of the battle. Every step closer to the Chancellery meant fighting against defenders who had nowhere to retreat and nothing left to lose. Strategically, the Soviet assault was planned with care. Emotion was present. Of course, for many soldiers this was personal, the bitter closure to years of loss. but the command structure treated the Chancellery complex as a stubborn military objective, not simply a trophy. Reconnaissance teams mapped likely strongpoints, shattered ministries still holding machine gun nests, piles of rubble concealing anti-tank teams, stairwells that led into underground paths. Artillery was repositioned to hammer the last barricades without clogging the streets too badly for tanks. Infantry assault groups were formed into compact units designed to fight in buildings and basements as naturally as they fought in open fields. The Soviets did not storm forward in a reckless wave. They pressed forward like a slow tide that refused to pull back. The German defenders understood this tide was coming. Their positions in the outer government area had been chewed down day after day, and now most resistance was compressed into the streets, feeding directly into the Chancellery and Reichstag zone. The defenders were an exhausted mosaic. SS guards still rigid with ideological commitment, Wehrmacht remnants clinging to duty, Volkssturm boys and old men clutching Panzerfausts with shaking hands, and a scattering of civilians pressed into errand running or barricade work. They were cut off from meaningful supply. Ammunition was rationed like bread. Medical aid had become a rumor. Yet they still fought, partly out of fear of what surrender might bring, partly because the regime had trained them to see death as preferable to defeat, and partly because in a collapsing city, the simplest instinct is to hold whatever ground is beneath your boots. The outer approaches to the Chancellery were defended in layers. Barricades rose in overlapping lines, forcing attackers into tight corridors of rubble where guns could rake them from both sides. Mines were placed in courtyards and along sidewalks. Snipers inhabited upper floors of half-ruined buildings, firing through holes that looked like empty eyes in broken facades. Every alley leading inward felt like a throat. Every open square felt like a hunting ground. The first Soviet pushes were aimed at these outer defenses. Infantry moved behind the rolling weight of artillery fire, guided through smoke by officers who had learned to read silence and sudden movement as warning signs. Tanks crept forward with infantry pressed close against their hulls, using the armor as a moving wall. When tanks met barricades too thick to breach directly, engineers stepped up, clearing mines and packing demolition charges into the rubble. A blast would open a path. A tank would lumber through, and infantry would pour in behind it. Progress was never smooth. Sometimes, a squad advanced across a courtyard only to be caught by sudden machine gun fire from a cellar window. Sometimes a tank turned into a broad avenue and was struck at close range by a Panzerfaust, its metal belly erupting into flame, forcing infantry to scatter for cover. Sometimes a building thought cleared flared alive again when German defenders emerged from underground connections behind Soviet lines. Urban combat does not allow neat conclusions. It's a fight of constant checking, rechecking, and then checking again. Still, the Soviet line moved closer. The Chancellery complex itself was a strange fortress. Above ground, it was a sprawling structure with heavy stone wings and long corridors, partially ruined by bombardment. Around it lay the gardens and courtyards that had once hosted parades and receptions. Those gardens were now scarred with craters and littered with broken statues, fallen trees, and twisted iron. They offered little cover to defenders, but also little ease to attackers. Crossing them was a gamble made under sniper sightlines and artillery bursts. Soviet artillery began to concentrate on the Chancellery's immediate perimeter. The shelling was heavy but deliberate, aimed at known defensive rooms and possible entrances to underground tunnels. The Red Army wanted to break resistance without destroying the approaches they needed to move through. It was a cruel balance. Too much fire would collapse the streets and bury attackers in rubble. Too little would leave strong points intact. So the guns worked in pulses, with forward observers adjusting fire based on what infantry reported. When a section of wall caved or a window went silent, the assault groups moved in. Inside the Chancellery and its surrounding buildings, fighting shrank into very small spaces. It was no longer about fronts and flanks. It was about hallways, doorways, stairwells, and dark rooms where men fired at shadows. Soviet infantry advanced carefully, often breaching through internal walls rather than doors, because doors might be rigged with explosives or covered by a machine gun inside the next room. Grenades were used relentlessly. A small explosion in an office could clear a corner that might otherwise cost 3 men. German defenders fought like men trapped in a burning house. They fired from behind desks and masonry piles, retreated to the next stairwell when a room was lost, and sometimes countercharged when they thought the Soviets had overextended. The SS in particular often held positions far beyond reason, continuing to shoot from shattered rooms even after being surrounded. Their resistance was not tactical, it was existential. In the midst of this, civilians remained hidden in the underground spaces around the district. Some were beneath the Chancellery gardens, in bunker networks, and basements inherited from government constructions. Others were a few blocks away in cellar shelters, listening to the battle roll over them like thunder above a cave. They had no idea which side controlled the street outside, and often no way to find out. For days they had lived by fragments, the shake of a shell, the muffled sound of boots overhead, languages shouted in clipped bursts. Their survival depended on staying invisible, quiet, and very lucky. In some shelters, civilians shared space with wounded soldiers dragged underground by comrades. In others, Volkssturm boys used cellar stairwells as firing points, stepping out to shoot before retreating back into darkness. Every civilian space in the district had become a military space too. That did not come from ideology alone, it came from necessity. There was no separate world left. As Soviet forces pressed inward, they encountered the underground networks that laced the government quarter. These tunnels and basements were defensive veins. A German squad could vanish through a hole in a floor and reappear 2 buildings away. A sniper could retreat underground before being pinned. A pocket of defenders could hold out below ground even when the surface had fallen. For the Soviets, this meant the war was not only above them, but beneath their feet, in spaces where light was scarce and sound traveled strangely. Engineers and sappers followed the infantry with special caution. They checked for mines, booby traps, and hidden passages. They sealed off tunnels when possible, flooded some, smoked others out. Sometimes they had to clear basements room by room, pushing through ankle-deep water and debris, listening for movement in the dark. The enemy was often invisible until he fired. The struggle around the Reichstag grew fiercer as well. Although the Reichstag was not the bunker, it was the towering emblem of German power. To raise the Soviet flag, there would be to announce the war's ending in a single, unforgettable image. Defenders knew this, and they fought hard to deny it. Soviet soldiers knew it too, and every casualty taken in its approaches felt charged with a kind of grim importance. The assault on the Reichstag fed the assault on the Chancellery. Both objectives were intertwined in geography and meaning. As Soviets secured one street leading to the Reichstag, they opened a flank toward the Chancellery. As Germans retreated from one ministry, they crowded deeper into another. The district's defenses were collapsing inward like a lung losing air. By April 30, the pressure had become suffocating. Soviet units were now in direct contact with the Chancellery's last surface defenses. The outer buildings had been taken or neutralized. The courtyards were under Soviet fire control. Tanks were positioned to suppress windows and doorways. Infantry prepared for the final clearing push. Inside the bunker beneath the Chancellery, the war had become a muffled reverberation. The Führerbunker was not a mythical lair. It was a concrete maze, built to survive bombs, not inevitability. Its corridors were narrow, its air stale and heavy with smoke, and its rooms, once intended for command, now stank of exhaustion and panic. The men and women inside heard the artillery overhead. They heard the thud of tanks in the streets. They felt the tremor of demolition charges above their ceilings. They knew that the surface world was slipping away. Hitler remained there, issuing orders that could not be carried out. Some of those around him had already accepted their fate. Others still tried to cling to procedure. But the bunker was no longer a command center. It was a waiting room for history. Above, Soviet assault groups continued their final reduction. Strong points in the Chancellery's ruins were cleared one after another. German defenders fell back to the last internal stairwells, some surrendering when confronted, others shooting until silence took them. The Soviet advance was now so close that even their own commanders had to restrain the urge to rush. In urban warfare, haste kills. They moved instead with careful violence, ensuring each section was secured before moving to the next. The battle's soundscape was relentless. Short bursts of rifle fire, the deeper cough of machine guns, the roaring crack of tank cannons, the sharp snap of grenades, the slow, crumbling groan of walls giving way. The air was thick with soot and pulverized stone. Men's faces were gray with dust, their eyes rimmed with fatigue. Yet their bodies kept moving because the momentum of a battle this large has its own gravity. By the end of this phase, the Reich Chancellery was effectively in Soviet hands at the surface level. The remaining defenders were either killed, captured, or driven underground. The Führerbunker was isolated. It was not yet fully breached, but the encirclement was complete. There were no supplies coming in, no corridors leading out that were not under Soviet control. The regime's deepest retreat had become a sealed chamber. Outside, Berlin's center was glowing with fires that did not go out. Civilians in the basements listened as the battle passed directly over them, then lingered, then settled into a quieter, stranger silence. The city that had been storm and thunder for days was now holding its breath. What remained was not the long contest of armies anymore. It was the final unraveling of a command that had already collapsed in spirit. The next chapter will descend into that bunker world, into the last hours of decision, delusion, despair, and surrender, where the end of the Third Reich would not be shouted from a balcony, but whispered in the stale air of concrete corridors. The final days in the Führerbunker, collapse of command. By the time the Soviet assault reached the Chancellery grounds, the bunker beneath them had already become a world apart. Above, Berlin's center was dissolving into fire and broken stone. Below, in the sealed corridors of concrete and steel, time moved strangely, stretched thin by exhaustion, compressed by fear. The Führerbunker was not large, not grand, and certainly not the kind of place one might imagine as the command heart of a modern empire. It was practical and claustrophobic, carved out of necessity and paranoia. Its low ceilings pressed down on every conversation. Its air was stale from too many bodies and too few open vents. The electric lights buzzed at all hours, making day and night feel the same. It was a shelter designed to resist bombs, but it could not resist what was happening outside. In those final days, the bunker filled with a silence that was never complete. It was a silence interrupted by distant and near explosions, by hurried footsteps in narrow hallways, by voices that rose in frustration and fell again into resignation. The people inside lived by vibrations. A burst of artillery overhead would rattle cups and light fixtures. A closer hit would shake dust from the ceiling. Each tremor carried a simple message. They were closer now. Hitler remained in the bunker, bringing with him the atmosphere of collapse. His physical condition had deteriorated harshly. Tremors in his hands and a shuffling gait betrayed years of illness and stress. His face was drawn, his eyes often distant, yet he clung to the posture of command, the habit of issuing orders, the belief that willpower might still bend reality. The bunker staff had watched his decline for months, but now it was unfolding in a tight space with no distractions. There was nowhere else to look. Every pattern of behavior became magnified by proximity. Every mood swing, every burst of anger, every long silence. When he stared at a map that no longer mattered, the military situation outside was beyond repair. Soviet forces had broken through the outer ring days earlier. They were in the government district now. They were near the Reichstag. They were in the Chancellery garden. For Berlin's remaining defenders, command had become a word rather than an instrument. Units were scattered or surrounded, telephones were dead or cut, radio channels were jammed or simply fell quiet because the men on the other end had been killed. The war above ground had shrunk into pockets that fought without coordination, clinging to streets as if holding a street could change the shape of the world. Still, in the bunker, meetings continued. Hitler held conferences with generals who could offer nothing but grim updates. The map room became a stage for unspoken tension. Officers would enter, muddy and ash-stained, and stand stiffly while Hitler questioned them. He asked about armies that no longer existed in meaningful form. He demanded counterattacks from divisions reduced to handfuls. He spoke of relief forces that could not reach Berlin. The men around him understood the truth, but few dared to name it. They had lived too long in a system where truth was dangerous. Some tried gentle language, describing positions as difficult or uncertain. Others used numbers that hinted at collapse without saying it. But each report was a thread pulled from an already unraveling cloth. With every update, the bunker's emotional air thickened. You could feel people holding their breath after a sentence, waiting to see if Hitler would explode, dismiss the report, or retreat into his own private logic. He often chose retreat. It wasn't only denial, it was a kind of limping imagination, still printing plans though the press was burning. He reassigned units on paper. He demanded reorganizations that could not occur. He spoke of last reserves that were already dead. The bunker staff watched these meetings with the numbness of people witnessing a storm from inside a locked cellar. They could hear the wind, they could feel the pressure of it, but they could not stop it, and they could not escape. Touching all of this was the presence of a few loyal inner circle figures. Goebbels was there, pale, frantic, still trying to wrap catastrophe in meaning. Bormann hovered as bureaucrat and gatekeeper, controlling access, whispering counsel, collecting scraps of authority as they fell. Military aides moved between rooms like ghosts, carrying clipped messages and returning with fewer answers each time. Secretaries typed as if routine itself could stave off emptiness. In the evenings, the bunker's narrow mess area would fill with people eating whatever remained of stored food, listening to the muffled artillery and trying to speak about something other than the obvious. Sometimes they succeeded for a few minutes. Someone would remark on a memory, on a piece of old news, on a rumor from upstairs. But the conversation always drifted back to the approaching end, because the end was everywhere. It lived in the shaking ceiling. It lived in the breathless pauses between explosions. It lived in the way each person measured their words now, as though language could still influence fate. Outside, Berlin's defenders were collapsing in real time. The remnants of the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Volkssturm fought in fragmented clusters. Some clung to positions because they believed surrender meant death. Others fought because they had nowhere to go. Some had no idea who was in command anymore. They simply fired at red-starred helmets appearing through smoke. Every street remained dangerous, but the strategic meaning of streets was fading. It was no longer a battle for a city. It was a battle for directionless survival. The civilians in the government district were trapped in the same sense of narrowing. Basements and shelters held families who had not seen the sky in days. Water was scarce. Food was worse. The air was damp and crowded with fear. The very old and the very young struggled most, but none were spared the strain. When shelling hit close, children cried into their mother's clothing until there were no tears left. Adults whispered to each other about whether to flee, but fleeing meant crossing streets under fire, past snipers, and into a city where you did not know who controlled what. Many stayed because stillness seemed safer than movement. The bunker was sealed against the world, but it was not sealed against knowledge. People still slipped in from above: couriers, wounded men, staff members who had been outside for moments. Each brought fragments. The Russians are in such and such street. The garden is under fire. The Reichstag is being attacked. Those fragments were enough to paint the full picture. The Red Army wasn't approaching anymore. It had arrived. And with that arrival, the bunker's social order began to buckle. One can withstand fear when there is still a pathway of hope. But when fear is married to certainty, hope becomes something else. A private mechanism of denial, a ritual of sentence-making to avoid looking straight at the void. Within the bunker, some people began quietly preparing for death. Cyanide capsules were distributed or already held close. Husbands and wives spoke in low voices behind closed doors. Aides thought about escape routes that were not truly routes at all. Every decision to surrender, to flee, to die, carried unbearable risk, because no one knew the future that waited just beyond the concrete walls. Hitler's decision-making became more unstable, weaving between fury and lethargy. At times he raged against imagined betrayal, against generals he deemed weak, against a world that had not followed his vision. At other times, he sank into minutes-long silences, as though listening to a distant voice that only he could hear. Those around him read these moods carefully, because the bunker was a small ecosystem and Hitler's mood was its weather. On April 29, the bunker witnessed something that felt almost surreal in its normality. Hitler married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a brief civil ceremony. The act was both tender and disquieting. Tender because it was human, disquieting because it occurred in a tomb. The bunker staff, some with hollow eyes, some with forced smiles, offered congratulations. The sound of artillery rolled overhead like a drum beat in a church. There was no music, there was no future. Yet for a moment, the ritual of marriage created a small island of order in the surrounding chaos. Later that day, Hitler dictated what would become his political and personal testament. His words were sharp, accusatory, delusional, and still fiercely committed to the ideology that had led them here. The regime was falling, but in his mind, the story was not a failure of his vision. It was a failure of others to live up to it. In writing, he tried to preserve a version of history that absolved him and condemned the world. It was a kind of final battle fought with sentences. Above ground, Soviet soldiers continued clearing the last buildings around the chancellery. They moved through rubble-strewn halls and gutted offices. They encountered desperate resistance in spots, but the overall resistance was thinning. German units were surrendering in clusters or being wiped out. The ring around the bunker tightened like a vice. Soviet engineers searched for entrances and ventilation shafts. They knew the bunker was there. The question was no longer if it would fall. It was how and when. Inside, the nights grew harder. Sleep became brief, punctuated by jolts of fear and the noise of battle. When people did sleep, they often woke, confused, unsure if it was morning or evening. Cigarette smoke hung in the corridors like fog. The bunker's medical room, sparse and strained, treated wounded aides and soldiers who staggered in from above. There were fewer supplies each day. Even bandages became precious. The sense of collapse was not loud. It was quiet and heavy, like a ceiling slowly lowering. On April 30, the day that would enter history in stark, cold language, Hitler's isolation reached its endpoint. Word from above made it clear the Soviets were within a few hundred meters. The Reichstag was in flames. The chancellery surface defenses were broken. The bunker was effectively surrounded. There was no relief coming. No counterattack could reverse this. The entire world outside that concrete box had shifted into a new era. Hitler chose death. The details inside the bunker were hurried, hushed, and afterward wrapped in confusion. He and Eva withdrew into private rooms. A gunshot was heard. Cyanide was used. When the doors reopened, those closest to him saw what they had dreaded and expected all at once. The body of Hitler was carried up toward the garden exit as artillery shook the ground and set on fire in an attempt to prevent its capture. It was a grim ritual, performed under the whistling breath of shells in a city already burning. The fire in the garden did not look like triumph. It looked like a last human attempt at control over something that no longer belonged to them. For the bunker staff, Hitler's death was not an ending. It was a release of tension into a new, terrifying uncertainty. Some broke down. Some became numb. Some immediately began thinking about escape. Goebbels, bound tightly to Hitler's worldview, briefly assumed a kind of symbolic leadership. But it was leadership over a ship already sunk. Orders issued from the bunker after April 30 were echoes. Above, Soviet forces continued to press forward. The Chancellery grounds were now mostly secured. Soviet soldiers moved into the ruins and began searching for bunker access points. German defenders, hearing of Hitler's death or simply feeling the final collapse, surrendered in larger numbers. The Red Army took prisoners methodically. The battle above was shifting from combat to consolidation, but it was still dangerous. A corner could still spit gunfire. A basement could still hide a frightened boy with a Panzerfaust. War does not stop on a switch. It bleeds out. In the bunker, desperation thickened. Some tried to negotiate surrender. Some planned a breakout attempt through the underground routes toward the north. Some sat in silence, staring at walls. For a moment, the bunker became a place without a center. Authority, already hollow, collapsed entirely. And in that hollow, human instincts took over. Survival, fear, grief, and in some cases, a stubborn commitment to die rather than face the world outside. Goebbels made his own decision soon after. He and his wife killed their children in the bunker, a horrific act that reflected the depth of ideological possession, and then took their own lives. It was not a defense, it was a final surrender to a worldview that had always preferred annihilation to repentance. Others in the bunker followed similar paths. The bunker became, in its last hours, less a military site than a closing chamber of a cult. Meanwhile, civilians in the surrounding district began to surface cautiously from shelters. Some emerged with white cloths tied to sticks. Some stumbled out looking dazed, as if waking from a nightmare. They encountered Soviet soldiers who were themselves exhausted, their faces pinched with fatigue. The meeting between conqueror and conquered was tense, human, uneven. Some civilians felt relief, some felt terror, most felt only emptiness. Their city was gone, and what replaced it would take years to understand. By May 1, the bunker was no longer a functioning nerve center. It was a broken refuge with dwindling life. Soviet troops were above it. The air inside was heavy with smoke, sweat, and resignation. The people still alive inside knew they were standing on the edge of capture or death, and they understood, however quietly, that the world they had served had ended here, in these narrow corridors beneath a ruined garden. The collapse of German command did not happen in a single speech or a single signature. It happened as communications died, as units vanished, as maps became lies, and finally as the bunker itself lost its leader, and with him, the last illusion of control. In those final days, Berlin's center became the stage not only for a military ending, but for a psychological one, the ending of a belief system that had demanded everything and now left only ash. And above the bunker, the Red Army moved through the ruins toward full control, carrying with them the heavy, complicated finality of victory. Surrender and consolidation. The Red Army takes Berlin. When a city dies in war, it rarely does so in a single blow. Berlin did not fall like a curtain, all at once, in clean, dramatic certainty. It fell the way exhausted bodies fall first in the limbs, then in the chest, and finally in the mind. By the first days of May 1945, the heart of the capital had already stopped beating in any organized way, yet pockets of resistance still twitched across the ruins, and the Red Army still moved cautiously, because even in a defeated city, a single hidden rifle could still take a life. Above the shattered government district, the smoke had begun to thin. The roar of artillery that had defined every hour was now interrupted by something else, an odd, shifting quiet. It wasn't peace, it was the pause between the last battles, the kind of silence that carries danger, because no one knows whether the next sound will be a shot, a surrender call, or a scream. Soviet forces advanced through streets that no longer resembled streets at all. Walls had folded across asphalt. Tram lines hung in twisted loops. Water mains had burst and pooled in craters, reflecting dim light like small, broken mirrors. The soldiers moved in disciplined columns, but their discipline had a different feeling now. It was no longer the momentum of attack. It was the focus of clearing. Each ruined building had to be understood before it could be passed. Each doorway had to be checked. Each stairwell might conceal a furious last defender or a terrified child. The Red Army's consolidation was methodical because it had to be. Urban warfare leaves behind traps when the fighting ends. Booby-trapped corridors, mines scattered under rubble, snipers who refuse to believe defeat is real. Soviet engineers, sappers hardened by months of siege fighting, worked with almost ritual care. They probed the ground with poles, pulled apart barricades, tested staircases for hidden explosives, and marked safe passages so that infantry and armor could follow. Their work was slow, dusty, and silent, and it saved lives no battlefield glory could replace. In many areas, resistance had already collapsed into surrender. German soldiers emerged in small groups from basements and shattered courtyards, hands raised, weapons slung low or cast aside. Some were professional Wehrmacht troops, hollow-eyed and gray with exhaustion. Others were Volkssturm boys, still wearing oversized uniforms, faces pinched with fear and disbelief. There were SS men too, some defiant to the last. Others with the same drained expression as any defeated soldier when the world they believed in dissolves around them. Surrender was not uniform. It came in fragments, like the city itself. One cellar door would open to 3 men, offering rifles and a ragged white cloth. 2 streets away, another pocket might keep firing, unable to accept the reality or too afraid of what surrender might bring. Soviet commanders had learned to expect this uneven rhythm. They ordered loudspeaker calls, sent messengers under flags of truce, and in some cases simply overwhelmed holdouts with brief, concentrated fire. The goal now was not conquest. Conquest was already achieved. The goal was safety, control, and an end to loss. The official surrender in Berlin unfolded in layers. The first layer was practical. The men in the ruins who chose life over hopeless resistance. The second was political and military. Officers attempting to negotiate with Soviet command. Sometimes in confusion, sometimes in sharp clarity, sometimes too late to change anything. The third was psychological. A city realizing that the war that had consumed it was over, even if the smoke still stung the eyes. Inside the Reich Chancellery area, Soviet troops moved with particular care. This was the symbolic center of the war's European conclusion, and everyone knew it. The Chancellery buildings were half collapsed, their once grand corridors now a shell of scorched stone and exposed steel. Soviet soldiers walked through rooms that had been painted, polished, and staged for power only weeks before. Now those rooms were no more than debris fields. The contrast between what they had represented and what they had become was almost unbearable in its simplicity. They found documents scattered in damp piles. They found broken furniture, torn portraits, smashed glass. They found signs of hurried abandonment. The bunker entrances were soon secured, ventilations checked, corridors searched. Some Soviet troops descended into those underground spaces with flashlights and drawn weapons, expecting last-ditch defenders or traps. What they encountered instead was a kind of grim aftermath: stale air, overturned chairs, walls scrawled with orders that were already meaningless. The bunker was cleared not like a battlefield, but like a tomb. Above ground, the processing of prisoners began immediately. The Red Army had fought long enough to understand that victory can become chaos if prisoners are not controlled and catalogued. Surrendering Germans were gathered into makeshift holding areas, courtyards, parks, cleared intersections. Weapons were stacked, ammunition removed, officers separated from enlisted men. Soviet troops inspected identity, papers, checked insignia, and in some cases searched bodies for hidden pistols or poison capsules. It was a cold, procedural work, but after months of slaughter, procedure was a kind of mercy. It prevented surprises. It prevented revenge spirals. It helped keep the city from slipping into a second, uncontrolled violence. For the German soldiers, surrender was a passage into an uncertain world. Many were relieved simply to be alive. Some wept openly, the strain finally leaving their bodies. Others stood rigid, refusing to give the Soviets even the dignity of a visible emotion. A few tried to vanish into civilian crowds. Some carried fear like a second uniform, fear of reprisals, fear of labor camps, fear of an unknown future in a defeated nation. And behind all of that fear, there was the quiet, heavy weight of shame for some and bewilderment for others. After years of propaganda promising victory or heroic downfall, they had reached the end and found only surrender. Civilians began emerging more boldly, though still with caution. For weeks, Berliners had lived under the earth, basements, U-Bahn tunnels, cellar rooms behind bricked walls. The underground had held them like a bitter womb. Some had not seen daylight since the final assault began. When they stepped out now, they blinked like people waking from fever. Their clothes were torn, their faces pale. Their hands carried bundles of whatever they had managed to save. A pot, a coat, a small photograph, a child's toy. They walked into a city that was unrecognizable. Landmarks were gone. Streets had vanished under rubble. Familiar squares were now cratered and blackened. They moved quietly, instinctively, as though any loud sound might bring the shelling back. The elderly in particular often moved with a slow, careful dignity, carrying a lifetime of memory through a landscape that had erased almost everything else. Many searched for missing relatives, calling names through broken courtyards. Some found no answer. Some found bodies. Some found a living face and collapsed into wordless relief. The Red Army, now turning from combat to occupation, was forced into a role it had not trained for in any gentle way. Soldiers were still in fighting posture. They were exhausted, hungry, and carrying the mental weight of brutal campaigning. Yet they were now the authority in a shattered city of civilians. Their commanders established patrol routes, checkpoints, and security zones. They posted guards at key intersections. They issued curfews, not only to control the population, but to control their own troops and prevent the loose chaos that so often blooms after a city falls. In the first hours after fighting ceased in a district, Soviet patrols moved through neighborhoods to collect weapons, prevent looting, and locate any remaining German fighters. They also had to handle civilians who were frightened, angry, pleading, or numb. Some Berliners met them with terrified silence. Others offered cautious cooperation. Many simply watched, trying to understand what kind of occupation this would be. From the Soviet perspective, consolidation was also about narrative. Berlin was not just another city. It was the crown of the war in Europe. Soviet photographers and officers recorded the capture of key sites. The Reichstag, already famous for its symbolic power, became the most dramatic stage of all. The red flag raised there was more than cloth. It was a statement to the world and to history that the Nazi Empire had ended under Soviet hands. The images would travel far beyond Berlin's ruins, shaping memory long after the rubble was cleared. But for the people who lived in those ruins, symbolism mattered less than water and food. Almost immediately, the humanitarian crisis became visible. Wells were contaminated, pipes were shattered. Food stocks had already been depleted by months of siege and rationing. The city's hospitals were broken shells full of wounded, with too few nurses and almost no supplies. Diseases lurked in crowded shelters. Corpses lay in streets and courtyards, not yet buried, because burial was as dangerous as any battle when snipers had still been active days before. Soviet forces established emergency aid points, sometimes out of genuine concern, sometimes out of practical necessity. Hungry civilians make unstable cities. Field kitchens were set up where possible. Water distribution points were organized. Medical teams, stretched thin after years at war, began triage for civilians, especially the wounded and the sick. German medical personnel who remained were often pressed into service, working alongside Soviet doctors to stem a catastrophe too large for any one army. The transition from war to occupation is never clean. Berlin's street corners still smelled of gunpowder. The dead lay beside the living. The future had not yet arrived in any comforting way. Yet the rhythm of life, battered but stubborn, began to reassert itself. Children were among the first to show it. Some emerged from shelters holding hands, silent at first, then curious. In places where shelling had stopped, they began to wander, to pick through rubble, to stare at tanks with a strange mixture of fear and fascination. Adults scolded them to stay close, but the pull of daylight was strong. After weeks underground, the open air itself felt like a miracle, even if it was filled with smoke. In many neighborhoods, civilians and Soviet troops worked around each other in an uneasy truce. Soldiers cleared mines and barricades. Civilians cleared bodies and debris from doorways. Some Berliners began makeshift shelters in partly intact buildings. Others organized small groups to search for food. Women queued for hours at relief stations, pots and bottles in hand, their faces expressionless from exhaustion. For German officers still attempting to command fragments of defense, the end was brutal in its swiftness. Many units had already dissolved. Those still intact faced Soviet military authority with no bargaining power. The last official Berlin surrender was transmitted and enforced not because a paper made it so, but because the city had already become impossible to defend. History sometimes prefers neat dates and signatures, but the truth on the ground is that Berlin surrendered in 1,000 separate moments, each of them a human decision made under unimaginable pressure. As the days passed, those separate moments congealed into a new reality. Soviet control spread across the whole of central Berlin. Remaining holdouts were rooted out. Festivals of gunfire became rare. The soundscape shifted toward machinery. Engineers clearing rubble, trucks moving prisoners, field kitchens rattling, boots on patrol. The war, in its loudest sense, was ending. Yet victory did not taste sweet to everyone who held it. Soviet soldiers walked past the bodies of comrades lost in the final streets. They moved through a city that was itself a grave. They were proud, yes, and some were jubilant, but they were also tired in their bones. A few sat on broken steps and smoked in silence, letting the reality settle in. They had come from Stalingrad, from Kursk, from the endless east, and now they were here in the capital of the enemy, surrounded by ruin. The scale of the sacrifice was too immense for celebration to erase. For Berliners, surrender was both relief and dread. Relief because survival was suddenly possible in a way it hadn't been the day before. Dread because survival now depended on strangers. The Nazi world had collapsed, but the shape of the next world was unclear, and uncertainty is its own kind of fear. Still, by early May, the city's last organized resistance had ended. The Reich Chancellery was secured. The bunker was in Soviet hands. The government district was fully controlled. Prisoners had been processed into the thousands. The flag of the Third Reich had vanished from its own capital. Berlin had become a city held by the Red Army physically, militarily, symbolically. The fighting that began with artillery and tanks was ending with lists, patrols, and relief stations. The world had turned a page, though the ink was still wet with grief. And in the ruins, amid the smoke and silence, the survivors, soldiers, and civilians alike stood at the edge of a future they could not yet imagine, carrying the weight of what had ended and the fragile hope of what might finally begin. Ruins, reckoning, and the hunt for shadows. Berlin, after the fall. When the guns finally fell quiet, Berlin did not breathe a sigh of relief the way a saved city might. It exhaled something heavier: smoke, dust, grief, and a kind of stunned disbelief. Victory and defeat had been decided, But the city itself had to learn how to live again, and that is always the harder task. For weeks, it had been a furnace of artillery, firestorms, street fighting, and fear. Now it was a landscape of silence, broken by the scrape of shovels, the creak of unstable walls, and the voices of people who had survived something they could barely name. In the first mornings after surrender, Berlin looked less like a capital and more like the aftermath of an earthquake that had been followed by a storm of steel. Entire blocks were leveled. Walls stood open like broken teeth. Staircases led nowhere. A church spire leaned at a dangerous angle. Factories were gutted shells. Somewhere a tram sat half buried in rubble, its windows punched out, its metal frame buckled by heat. The city's famous boulevards had become corridors of debris and craters. Even the air felt damaged, smelling of damp plaster, burned fuel, rotting food, and the faint metallic tang of blood. For the civilians who emerged from cellars and tunnels, the destruction was not a dramatic revelation, but a slow, numbing reality. They stepped into daylight, carrying bundles and children, blinking against ash-gray skies. Many had been underground for days, some for weeks. Their faces were pale, stretched tight by hunger and sleeplessness. Their clothes were stiff with soot. In the ruins, they moved at first like sleepwalkers, not trusting that quiet was real, not expecting safety to last. Some stood at the mouths of basements and simply stared, as if trying to match the city before them with the one they remembered. Others walked without a word, in search of water, food, or a missing family member whose last known location might now be a crater. The most immediate battle now was a battle for survival. Water was the first danger. Pipes had been shattered by shelling. Pumps had stopped. Wells were contaminated by debris and bodies. People lined up at any rumor of a functioning water point, carrying pots, bottles, battered buckets, even old vases. In desperate neighborhoods, women and elderly men lowered containers into flooded craters, straining the muddy water through cloth, hoping it wouldn't make their children sick. Each sip was a gamble. Already, disease was waiting to bloom in crowded shelters and ruined streets. Food came next. The city's stocks had been consumed long before the final assault. Under siege, Berliners had grown used to ration substitutes, thin soups, bread stretched with sawdust filler, scraps traded in the shadows. Now even those fragile threads were cut. Families scavenged among ruins for canned goods from shattered storerooms. Some dug up frozen potatoes from small garden plots. Others traded heirlooms for a loaf of bread. Hunger made people older and quieter. It also made them clever. Survival depended on improvisation. A stove built from bricks, a shelter patched with boards, a shared pot of nettle broth that traveled between apartments like a sacred object. Medical care was almost non-existent. Hospitals that stood at all were overwhelmed, their corridors filled with wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Supplies were sparse. Bandages were reused. Instruments were boiled if fuel could be found. Those who were injured in the final battles often died not from the wound itself, but from infection, dehydration, or simply being unreachable in a city dotted with mines and unstable ruins. The dead lay where they had fallen in courtyards, stairwells, and streets because burying them required time, strength, and sometimes permission from Soviet patrols, still clearing barricades and explosives. Soviet forces, now administrators as well as victors, began the slow work of stabilizing the city. Engineers cleared mines and unexploded shells from key routes. Infantry patrols established order, preventing the kind of uncontrolled chaos that can turn a defeated city into a second disaster. Field kitchens appeared where they could. Temporary medical stations were set up, often staffed by exhausted Soviet doctors who had already spent years patching men up at the front. German nurses and surviving doctors were pressed back into service, not because they were trusted, but because there was no other choice. The assistance was limited, too limited for the scale of suffering, but it was a beginning. It meant people could sometimes find water without risking a minefield. It meant a wounded child might reach a medic in time. It meant the city was slowly shifting from battlefield to occupied place. Still, the psychological wounds cut deepest. Berliners had endured years of propaganda and fear, then months of bombing, and finally, the raw terror of being at the center of a city-wide siege. Many had watched loved ones die in ways no person is meant to witness. Children who had lived in darkness now startled at every noise. Elderly men who had survived one war found themselves trembling through another. Women moved through ruins with grim resolve, their faces calm only because there was no strength left for panic. The collapse of the regime did not feel like liberation to most civilians. It felt like the floor vanishing under their feet. The world they had known, however cruel, however controlled, had ended. What replaced it was uncertain, and uncertainty is a hard thing to sleep with. Above the suffering, another process was unfolding, quieter yet historically enormous: the hunt for the last shadows of the Third Reich. For the Red Army, capturing Berlin was not just about holding streets. It was about proving, beyond any rumor or myth, that Nazi leadership had been extinguished. The Reich Chancellery and Hitler's bunker were seized with a kind of solemn urgency. These sites were symbols, and symbols matter in war's final act. Soviet troops moved through the ruined administrative buildings, combing offices, archives, and underground corridors. Intelligence teams collected documents in damp stacks, maps torn across tables, scattered directives that still carried the imprint of denial. Personal effects were gathered: letters, uniforms, medals, fragments of the private world in which leaders had lived while the city above them burned. The bunker itself was approached with extreme caution. It was a concrete labyrinth, cramped and stale, built to resist bombs but not reality. Soviet sappers searched entrances for traps. Infantry moved step by step through corridors lined with peeling paint and the sour smell of old air. They found abandoned rooms, evidence of hurried exits, and the marks of a final, desperate existence underground. The place had the weight of something ending not in glory, but in despair. Confirmation of Hitler's death became a priority. Rumors had traveled for weeks that he had fled, that he had negotiated, that he was hiding, that he had died. Soviet officers did not accept rumor. They demanded certainty. Witnesses were located: bunker staff, guards, couriers. Each testimony was compared carefully, cross-checked against what had been discovered. The story that emerged was bleak and final. Hitler had chosen suicide on the 30th of April 1945, as Soviet troops closed in. His death meant the head of the regime was gone, and with it the last excuse for organized resistance. But for the Soviets, establishing this fact was also a psychological victory. The man who had promised a 1,000-year empire had ended in an underground room, surrounded by collapse. Goebbels, the architect of Nazi propaganda, had also died in the bunker after killing his own children, an act that horrified even those who had seen the worst of war. His end reflected the fanaticism that had pushed Berlin to resist, long after resistance was sane. The loss of Goebbels wasn't only political, it was symbolic. The voice that had filled radios and rallies now lay silent beneath rubble. The spell had broken. Other leaders became objects of pursuit. Some were captured quickly, others disappeared into the confusion of the city's fall. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, was among the most sought after, his fate uncertain in the first days. SS officers and Gestapo personnel were hunted in apartments and safe houses. Documents recovered from their offices offered trails to follow: names, locations, last orders. Soviet intelligence understood that even a defeated ideology can become dangerous if its networks remain hidden. So they moved relentlessly through Berlin's ruins, arresting those who had enforced the regime, interrogating those who had planned its final days, and separating routine soldiers from those implicated in atrocities. This process served several purposes at once. It eliminated the chance of organized insurgency. It provided intelligence for the wider Soviet campaign into Germany. and it laid groundwork for post-war justice. Every document collected, every testimony recorded, every high-ranking figure detained was a brick in the future trials that would expose how this war had been waged and who had shaped it. Meanwhile, the city itself was slowly being turned into a controlled space. Soviet patrols guarded key buildings. Checkpoints monitored movement. Weapons were confiscated systematically. Not only rifles, but pistols, grenades, hidden caches in basements. The goal was to prevent chaos, but also to prevent revenge violence between civilians, defeated soldiers, and occupation troops. After years of brutal conflict, restraint was fragile. Authority had to be visible, steady, and unavoidable. Civilians experienced this new order in complicated ways. Some feared it deeply. Some accepted it with quiet resignation. Some were simply too exhausted to care who ruled as long as food came and bombs did not. Many civilians helped the Soviets in small, pragmatic ways, pointing out hidden weapons, guiding patrols through the destroyed city, translating for neighbors who misunderstood orders. It wasn't ideology, it was survival. The city's social fabric began to stitch itself back together in crude, makeshift seams. Neighbors formed small groups to clear rubble and reopen shared courtyards. Women traded information about functioning wells. Elderly men organized improvised watch rotations to protect shelters at night. Children, always the first to adapt, began to play quietly among ruins, building games out of broken bricks and scraps of wood. It was not innocence returning. It was life insisting on itself. Yet Berlin's fall was more than an ending. It was also an opening into a future that would be shaped by the victors now pacing its streets. Soviet command took careful note of the symbolic sites they controlled. Photographs were taken, reports drafted. The narrative of victory was being formed in real time. Berlin was the proof of Soviet endurance of a nation that had been invaded, burned, and bled, yet had marched to the enemy's capital and raised its flag there. For Soviet soldiers, this mattered. For the Soviet state, it mattered even more. And for the world watching from afar, Berlin's ruins would become the image of the Third Reich's definitive collapse. By the close of these first post-battle days, Berlin was a city still trembling, but no longer fighting. The Red Army held its streets. The core Nazi leadership was dead or captured, its machinery dismantled in smoky rooms and underground corridors. Civilians were exhausted, hungry, traumatized, but alive, emerging into a broken world with the slow determination of people who have nowhere else to go. The war in Berlin had ended, but the reckoning, both human and historical, had only begun. A city rebuilt, a world divided, Berlin's long road, from ruins to memory. When the last fires cooled and the first weeks of survival passed, Berlin entered a new kind of struggle. It was no longer the struggle of soldiers for streets, or the struggle of civilians for a cup of water in the rubble. It became the slow, complicated struggle of a shattered city, trying to remember who it was, while the world around it began to split into rival futures. In the summer of 1945, Berlin was still a city of wreckage. The bombs and shells had not merely damaged buildings, they had broken the very habits of life. Public transport ran only in fragments. Electricity flickered in a few districts and remained dead in others. Water lines were patched with temporary pipes. The smell of dust never fully left the air. Yet amid the ruins, recovery began, not as a grand plan announced from a podium, but as 1,000 small acts repeated daily. Clearing a stairwell, repairing a roof with salvaged tile, boiling water for neighbors, opening a schoolroom in a surviving church annex. The Soviet authorities, holding the city first, had already set up the early framework of order. Then the other Allied powers arrived to take responsibility for their zones, and Berlin became something strange and historic, a single city governed by 4 different victors. The boundaries were not yet walls, not yet barbed wire, not yet the hard line the world would come to know later, but they were there in practice. An American district here, a British district there, a French sector added later, and the Soviet sector holding the eastern half. The city had survived one division between life and death during the siege. Now it faced another, division by politics and ideology. At first, the occupation was meant to be cooperative. A joint command structure, councils, and liaison officers were set up to coordinate essentials: food distribution, policing, rebuilding roads and bridges. Everyone understood that a city this devastated could not be restored if each power pulled in its own direction. So there were meetings, schedules, agreements. Repair crews crossed sector lines because pipes didn't follow borders, and the electric grid certainly didn't care who controlled which street. But beneath all that cooperation lay a quiet and growing tension. The Soviet approach favored centralized control. Their officers saw Berlin's recovery as a matter of discipline, quotas, and rapid reorganization. Many German officials who had not been implicated in Nazi crimes were kept under supervision to help run daily functions. But ultimate authority was Soviet, direct and visible. In the western sectors, the approach leaned more toward rebuilding civilian institutions, local councils, neighborhood committees, a renewed press under strict oversight. The Americans and British believed stability would come fastest if Germans could gradually manage their own affairs, even while being denazified and watched carefully. These weren't just different styles of administration. They were different visions of how Europe should look after war. In daily life, civilians felt these differences quickly. A Berliner crossing from one sector to another might find different rules about curfews, different distribution schedules, different kinds of policing. One area might have slightly better access to supplies because of a functioning rail spur. Another might receive help from Western relief organizations that were more active there. A third might still be choked by rubble too deep to clear rapidly. People learned to read the city not only by its ruins, but by its new administrative rhythms. Where could you find bread on Tuesday? Which district offered medical aid? Where did you need a pass to move after dark? Survival was now tied to geography in a fresh way. Food remained the great pressure point. Berlin had almost no local agriculture to rely on, and national supply routes were shattered. Rationing continued, often with severe shortages. In many neighborhoods, official distributions were too thin to last the week, and civilians depended on scavenging, barter, and makeshift gardens in courtyards or bombed-out parks. A patch of potatoes behind a half-standing building could mean the difference between recovery and collapse. Elderly Berliners, people who had survived the First World War, inflation, and depression, became invaluable not because they were strong, but because they knew how to endure scarcity. They taught younger families how to stretch meals, how to store others' rations safely, how to keep a child alive on little more than soup and stubbornness. The rebuilding of housing was equally urgent. With so many homes destroyed, families moved into whatever spaces remained. Partially intact apartments, basements with patched ceilings, even abandoned offices and schools. A bedroom might now hold 3 families. A hallway could become a cooking area. People lived close enough to hear each other's breathing at night. Overcrowding brought friction, but it also brought a kind of forced community. Neighbors who had never spoken before the war now shared buckets of water and traded scraps of coal. The old social borders of class and party were stripped down by necessity. Reconstruction was not only physical, it was moral and psychological. Denazification began slowly and unevenly, but with clear intent. The Allies confiscated Nazi documents, banned symbols, dissolved party structures, and arrested those most responsible for atrocities. Former officials were questioned, categorized, sometimes barred from professional work. The process was imperfect, shaped by scarce manpower, the chaos of war's end, and the political goals of each occupation power. Still, it carried a shared purpose: to make sure the ideology that had led Europe into ruin could not simply reassemble itself in the quiet corners of peacetime. For civilians, this produced mixed feelings. Some were relieved, some were ashamed, some were defensive, others simply wanted bread more than justice. Many Berliners had been complicit in ways both small and large. Many had also been victims. In a broken city, the line between guilt and survival could blur. Yet the trials and investigations that followed, in Berlin and beyond, were part of the city's transformation from the capital of a murderous regime into a place that would eventually become a symbol of accountability. Schools reopened where possible. Sometimes schools meant a rebuilt classroom. Sometimes it meant a cold room with a chalkboard propped against a cracked wall. Children arrived thin, quiet, and older than their years. Lessons were interrupted by the practical needs of survival, finding fuel, clearing debris, helping families secure rations. Still, the reopening mattered. In the slow return of education, Berlin regained something essential: a future. For adults too, the routines of education offered order, a schedule, a bell, a morning that meant something other than scavenging. Cultural life returned in fragments. A theater without a roof might still host a small performance. A surviving library might open 2 days a week. Churches and synagogues that remained standing became anchors for community support, places to gather, to grieve, to share news. In those spaces, older Berliners found the kind of quiet continuity that helps people heal. You cannot rebuild a city without rebuilding the human spirit that lives inside it. Yet even as Berlin struggled toward normal life, it was becoming the center of something larger. Across Europe, alliances were shifting. The wartime unity that had crushed Nazi Germany was dissolving into suspicion. The Soviets saw themselves as the nation that had paid the highest blood price for victory, and they expected the right to shape Eastern Europe's political future. The Western allies, especially the United States, feared that Soviet influence would spread far beyond what had been agreed. Berlin, sitting deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, yet divided into 4 sectors, became a chessboard on which these fears and ambitions were tested. At first, the tension was subtle: disagreements about currency reform, about administrative control, about the direction of German recovery. Then, the subtlety began to fade. Sector boundaries hardened in practice. Different economic systems were introduced in different parts of the city. The western sectors received increasing support from the United States and its European partners, while the Soviet sector was tied more tightly to the political and economic model emerging in the East. Berlin's daily reality became a preview of the Cold War before the term was even fully understood. For Berliners, this new division was another kind of loss. They had survived war together under bombs. Now they were learning that even peace could fracture a city. A family might find itself with relatives in another sector that now required permits to visit. A worker could lose access to a job across a boundary. A friendship might slowly fray as political suspicion grew. The city was alive again, but its veins were being rerouted. Still, recovery continued. Roads were cleared, bridges rebuilt, trams were restarted line by line. Utilities recovered unevenly, but steadily. Economic life returned through a mix of official work and informal trade. People repaired bicycles, sold bread from small stalls, traded cigarettes for soap, built little workshops in courtyards. This wasn't prosperity. It was survival becoming stability, and then stability becoming identity. Because in time, Berlin became more than a rebuilt city. It became a memory made physical. The ruins of Nazi power, the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's bunker, the shattered ministries were documented, examined, and in some cases destroyed to prevent them becoming shrines. Yet their very existence, even in absence, sharpened Berlin's role as a city of reckoning. Museums and archives grew around the collected relics of war. Oral histories were recorded from survivors. Monuments began to appear not only for soldiers, but for civilians and victims of Nazi tyranny. Berlin acquired a new purpose: to remind the world what collapse looks like and what it costs to rebuild. For many older Berliners, memory was heavy. They carried personal grief, guilt, pride, relief, and confusion all at once. They also carried something that often goes unspoken: the strange ache of surviving history. When you are inside catastrophe, you do not think of it as history. You think of it as Tuesday, a basement, a missing child, a last potato. Only later does the world call it the Battle of Berlin, or the fall of the Third Reich, or the beginning of the Cold War. Survivors lived it first, then spent decades watching it become a story told to new generations. Berlin's long-term legacy rests in that transformation. It was the graveyard of the Nazi dream and the birthplace of Europe's post-war order. It showed the final brutality of total war in a modern city. It showed the slow resilience of civilians who had lost almost everything yet refused to vanish. And it showed how victory can plant the seeds of new rivalry, turning allies into opponents within just a few short years. By the late 1942, the city's division was no longer a temporary arrangement. It was a reality. Berlin became two worlds pressed into one map: East and West, Soviet and Western, communism and capitalism. The scars were no longer only in buildings. They were in politics, families, and futures. Yet even in division, Berlin remained Berlin: stubborn, wounded, resourceful, alive. It had been reduced to rubble and rebuilt by hands that were hungry and shaking. It had been occupied by powers that disagreed about the future. Yet citizens still planted gardens and reopened schools. It had become a symbol for the world, but to the people walking its streets, it was still home. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of all, that even after the loudest war and the sharpest political fracture, a city can still be carried forward by ordinary people, doing ordinary things: finding water, teaching a child, clearing a doorway, refusing to let ruin be the final word. And so, Berlin's story doesn't end with surrender. It continues in the slow footsteps of survivors, in rebuilt streets that once burned, and in memories that never fully fade. What happened there in 1945 was not just the collapse of a regime, but the birth of a new world, one half hopeful, one half fearful, both rising from the same ashes. As we move into the next chapter, we'll follow how this divided city became a front line of the Cold War, and why Berlin, more than any other place, came to carry the heartbeat of an age.